Hey guys, tonight we're embarking on a medieval pilgrimage to Canterbury, and I'm here to tell you exactly why your modern, comfort-loving self wouldn't make it past breakfast. Picture this. It's 1392. You're standing in the pre-dawn darkness outside a London church, your breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and somewhere in the jostling crowd of unwashed bodies, someone is already stealing from your travel bag. The roosters haven't even crowed yet, and you're already regretting every life choice that led you to believe walking 300 miles to touch a dead archbishop's bones would somehow cleanse your soul. Spoiler alert, you probably won't even make it to the city gates before seriously reconsidering this whole eternal salvation thing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing this community spread across all the time zones, from insomniacs in Tokyo to night shift workers in Toronto. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're jolted awake by church bells clanging in the darkness, their iron tongues splitting the silence of what your sleep-deprived brain insists is still the middle of the night. It's 4 in the morninger, as medieval people called it, a completely reasonable hour to begin a months-long journey of suffering. You stumble out of your straw-filled mattress, which has generously donated several families of fleas to your clothing, and immediately realize your first mistake. You fell asleep in your travel clothes because, let's be honest, you only own 2 outfits anyway, and one of them is for church. Outside, your pilgrimage group is already assembling in the church courtyard, a chaotic mass of humanity that looks less like a holy procession and more like a medieval flash mob organized by someone who forgot to send half the invitations. There are approximately 60 people here, give or take whoever's still vomiting behind the stable from last night's farewell ale, and not a single one of them looks like they'd help you if you collapsed on the road. Medieval pilgrimage groups were basically Tinder for religious travelers. You showed up, hoped for the best, and prayed you didn't get stuck with a murderer. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of English pilgrims hit the roads each year during the Middle Ages, creating a constant flow of foot traffic that turned major shrine routes into the medieval equivalent of a highway system, except the highway is mud and occasionally someone's corpse. Your group leader is a portly merchant named Gilbert who's done this route twice before, which apparently qualifies him as an expert despite the suspicious limp and the fact that he's missing 3 fingers on his left hand. Canterbury by Pentecost. He bellows with the confidence of a man who clearly hasn't looked at a calendar recently. You do some quick mental math. Pentecost is 7 weeks away. Canterbury is roughly 70 miles as the crow flies. And you are not a crow. You are a human with feet that are already sweating nervously in your leather shoes, which, and I cannot stress this enough, have no left-right distinction and will absolutely destroy your feet before sundown. The supplies situation is where things get really medieval really fast. You've brought what the guidebooks recommended, yes. They had guidebooks, usually in the form of advice passed down from drunk uncles who'd made the journey, which means you're carrying a wooden staff, a leather pouch containing approximately 3 days' worth of bread and hard cheese, a water skin that smells like the goat it used to be, and a spare pair of shoes that are somehow even worse than the ones you're wearing. Oh, and a small knife, because medieval England had bandits the way modern England has pigeons. Everywhere, aggressive, and probably interested in your snacks. Someone in the crowd is selling pilgrim badges already, which is like selling I Heartsuit New York shirts before anyone's actually gotten to New York. These cheap pewter tokens stamped with St. Thomas Becket's face are supposed to be purchased at the shrine as proof you actually made it. But clearly, this entrepreneur understands that some people enjoy lying about their accomplishments. You watch several pilgrims hand over coins for these fake badges, and you realize medieval pilgrimages had the same souvenir scam economy as modern tourist traps. Historians still argue whether these pre-journey badges were considered sacrilegious fraud or just savvy business. But honestly, the church was too busy selling indulgences to throw stones about religious merchandise ethics. The sky is beginning to lighten from black to a deeply uninspiring gray when Gilbert finally gets everyone's attention by banging his staff against a wooden cart. Right then, he announces, "We're following the Old Kent Road to Dartford today. Then we'll see about lodging." See about lodging. Not "we have lodging arranged," but "we'll see about it," which is medieval speak for "I hope you enjoy sleeping in a ditch." The Old Kent Road, which will eventually become the Monopoly Board's cheapest property. A legacy it's earning right now is the main artery out of London toward the southeast. And it's already clogged with traffic despite the absurd hour. You fall into step with the group, which immediately spreads out like a drunken accordion because nobody can agree on the proper walking pace. The fast walkers, probably showing off or possibly fleeing from creditors back in London, surge ahead. The slow walkers, including several elderly pilgrims who probably should have just written a strongly worded prayer instead of attempting this journey, lag behind. You're somewhere in the middle, sandwiched between a woman who won't stop praying loudly in Latin she clearly doesn't understand and a man whose personal hygiene situation suggests he interpreted spiritual cleansing as a substitute for actual cleansing. The road itself is an optimistic term for what's essentially a widened dirt track that thousands of feet, hooves, and wagon wheels have beaten into submission over centuries. When it's dry, it's a dust storm that coats your throat and turns your spit brown. When it's wet and you're in England, so it's basically always wet, it becomes a chocolate-colored soup of mud, animal excrement, and the occasional lost shoe. You watch a wagon ahead of you sink to its axles, requiring 6 men and a very unhappy ox to extract it, and you realize this is going to be a recurring theme of your journey. About an hour in, you make a horrible discovery. Medieval shoes are essentially leather bags stitched around your feet with leather thongs. They have no arch support, no cushioning, no proper sole, and they're designed with the same attention to ergonomics as a medieval torture device, which is to say, none whatsoever. Rich pilgrims might have shoes with a wooden sole, but you're not rich, so you're basically walking on leather socks filled with your own regret. The common folks' shoes were called turn shoes because they were sewn inside out and then turned right side out, a construction method that prioritized cheapness over literally any consideration for human comfort. Your feet begin their rebellion around mile 2. First comes the general soreness, which you try to ignore with the stoic determination of someone who's already committed to months of this nonsense. Then the hot spots develop those telltale patches of friction that are the opening arguments your skin is making for a full blister trial. By mile 3, you've got a full-blown blister on your right heel, and your left foot is developing what feels like a family of smaller blisters that are probably planning to merge into a super blister. You glance at your fellow pilgrims and realize everyone is walking with that special bow-legged gait of people whose feet are staging a coup. The sun is fully up now, which in medieval England is less glorious dawn, and more gray ceiling lights turned on in a dingy office. The landscape around you is a patchwork of fields, some being plowed by peasants who stop to stare at your procession with the dead-eyed exhaustion of people who'll never afford to go on pilgrimage themselves. You pass through small villages that consist of maybe a dozen wattle and daub houses, a church that's nicer than all the houses combined, and a suspicious number of pigs roaming freely like they own the place. Around mid-morning, the group stops for a break near a wayside cross, one of those stone markers that dot the pilgrimage routes to remind travelers to pray and also to mark distances in a time before mile markers. Everyone collapses in various states of distress. The woman who was praying in bad Latin is now crying softly while examining her feet. The unhygienic man has produced some kind of dried meat from his pouch and is gnawing on it with the few teeth he has left. You pull off your shoes to assess the damage and immediately wish you had entire feet look like they've been attacked by a tiny, very angry medieval torturer. Someone produces a flask of ale, which gets passed around in a beautiful display of medieval germ sharing. You take a swig because hydration is important, and also because the alternative is water from a roadside stream that probably has a dead sheep decomposing in it somewhere upstream. Medieval ale was weak, typically around 2 to 3% alcohol, because brewing it was the most reliable way to make water safe to drink. The alcohol killed some bacteria, the brewing process killed more, and honestly, being slightly buzzed probably helped medieval people cope with the general awfulness of existence. Gilbert is consulting with another veteran pilgrim, and you overhear them debating whether to push on to Dartford or stop at Southwark, which is apparently only a few miles back the way you came. The irony of possibly walking backward on your pilgrimage is not lost on you, but your feet are voting enthusiastically for any option that involves less forward motion. Historians still argue whether medieval pilgrims followed strict itineraries or just kind of wandered toward their destination like religious GPS systems with terrible reception. But your group seems to be firmly in the making it up as we go category. A merchant caravan passes you going the opposite direction, and you watch with envy as the merchants ride in relative comfort on their horses and wagons. One of them shouts something cheerful and probably sarcastic at your group, which Gilbert answers with a gesture that suggests ecumenical hand symbols haven't been invented yet. But the rude ones definitely have. The caravan's guards, armed men with serious faces and serious swords, eye your group with the professional assessment of people whose job is knowing which travelers to rob and which to protect. You notice some of your fellow pilgrims are already showing signs of serious strain. An older man is leaning heavily on his staff, his face the color of spoiled milk. A younger woman keeps stopping to adjust her bag, and you realize she's packed what appears to be her entire earthly possessions, including what might be a cooking pot. A well-dressed merchant type is sweating profusely despite the cool morning. His fancy wool cloak clearly more fashion statement than practical travel gear. These are your companions for the next several weeks, and statistically, not all of you are going to make it to Canterbury, let alone back home. The reality of medieval pilgrimage mortality rates is something the church didn't exactly advertise in their promotional materials. While exact numbers are impossible to pin down, scholars estimate that perhaps 5 to 10% of pilgrims on major routes didn't complete their journey, falling victim to disease, bandits, accidents, or simply the physical demands of walking dozens of miles per day in terrible shoes. The really grim part? Many pilgrims were already sick or elderly when they started, viewing the pilgrimage as either a last-ditch cure or a religiously acceptable way to die. You could literally call it extreme spiritual tourism for people with a death wish, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. Around noon, Gilbert announces you'll stop for a proper meal, which sounds promising until you realize meal means sitting in a field and eating whatever you brought with you. You pull out your bread, which has achieved a rock-like consistency in the few hours since you packed it, and your cheese, which is sweating in a way that cheese should not sweat. Other pilgrims are producing similar fare-dense rye bread, hard cheese, the occasional onion, and some suspicious dried fish that smells like it died of old age before being preserved. The conversation during this meal break reveals the diverse motivations of your fellow pilgrims. The crying Latin woman is doing penance for some unnamed sin, which everyone politely pretends not to speculate about while definitely speculating about it. The merchant is fulfilling a vow he made when he survived a shipwreck, though he seems fuzzy on the details and you suspect he might just be on a business trip and thought he'd multitask some salvation. A young couple is on pilgrimage to pray for a child, which seems like adding a baby to their problems would only make the walk home worse. But you keep that thought to yourself. Then there's the professional pilgrim, and yes, that's apparently a thing. His name is John, and he's made the Canterbury pilgrimage 17 times. 17. He travels from shrine to shrine, selling prayers, relics of questionable authenticity, and advice to first-timers like yourself. He's wearing a cloak absolutely covered in pilgrim badges from various holy sites: Canterbury, Walsingham, Santiago de Compostela, even Jerusalem, which is either genuinely impressive or the medieval equivalent of a laptop covered in brand stickers. You can't decide if he's deeply devout or running the world's most elaborate religious scam. Historians still argue whether professional pilgrims were genuine spiritual seekers or medieval grifters, but honestly, they were probably both, because people are complicated and the Middle Ages ran on a barter economy of prayers and lies. After the meal, Gilbert drops a bomb. You're not even close to Dartford. You're maybe 12 miles from London, which means you've covered roughly 12 miles and have 58 to go, and your feet already feel like they're auditioning for a role in a cautionary tale about foot care. The group's morale, which wasn't exactly soaring to begin with, drops like a stone in a well. Several people start arguing about whether to turn back, whether to rest longer, whether Gilbert even knows where he's going, and whether St. Thomas Becket is worth this nonsense anyway. You use this argument time to attempt some foot care. Medieval medicine for blisters ranged from wrap it in cloth and hope to apply various substances that will definitely make it worse. So you opt for the cloth wrapping method. You tear strips from your spare shirt, which you're now mentally demoting from spare to emergency bandage supply, and wrap your worst blisters. It helps approximately not at all, but at least you feel like you're doing something. The afternoon stretch is where the real suffering begins. The sun, despite being filtered through England's perpetual cloud cover, somehow finds a way to make you simultaneously sweaty and cold. Your wrapped blisters have blisters. Your legs are discovering muscles you didn't know you had, and they're all filing formal complaints. The group has spread out even more, with gaps of several hundred yards between the fastest and slowest walkers, which Gilbert insists is fine, but which definitely seems like a great way to lose people to bandits or despair. You pass through a village called something unpronounceable with way too many letters, where locals are selling refreshments at prices that suggest they understand basic supply and demand economics. A cup of weak ale costs a halfpenny, which is roughly what you'd earn for half a day's labor back home. A fresh loaf of bread is a full penny. A woman is selling what she claims are holy waters blessed by a traveling friar, which is probably just stream water in a different container, but 3 pilgrims buy it anyway because hope is cheaper than practical thinking. A group of children runs alongside your procession for a while, begging for coins and singing a song about Thomas Becket that's surprisingly bawdy considering it's about a murdered archbishop. Medieval kids learned early that pilgrims were a renewable resource to be harvested for loose change, and these enterprising youths have clearly perfected their craft. One particularly bold child tries to sell you a genuine splinter from the true cross, which is either the most sacred twig you've ever seen or just a regular twig. And honestly, the medieval relic market was flooded with so many true cross splinters that someone calculated you could build a small ship from them all. By late afternoon, you spot Dartford in the distance, which should be cause for celebration but mostly just triggers a Pavlovian response of, finally, somewhere to collapse. The town appears as a cluster of buildings around a church spire, smoke rising from various hearths, and what your optimistic brain hopes is an inn with actual beds. Gilbert announces that you'll seek lodging at the Pilgrim Hospice, which sounds official and organized until someone mentions that Dartford's hospice was built to accommodate maybe 20 pilgrims and you're a group of 60. The hospice, when you finally limp up to it around dusk, is a long stone building attached to a church that's seen better centuries. A tired-looking monk greets your group with all the enthusiasm of a man who's seen this show before and knows how it ends. "We have room for 30, he announces, which is monk speak for half of you are sleeping outside. A brief but intense negotiation ensues, involving Gilbert, several insistent pilgrims, and what appears to be a small bribe of alms for the church that looks suspiciously like a silver coin changing hands. You make the cut for indoor sleeping, though indoor is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The hospice's sleeping hall is a single large room with straw mattresses on the floor. No privacy, no individual spaces, just 60 bodies they managed to cram everyone in after all laid out like medieval sardines. The smell is immediate and overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, straw that's hosting its own ecosystem, smoke from the central hearth, and something else you can't quite identify but which your nose insists you don't want to. Dinner is provided, which seems generous until you see it. A watery pottage containing vegetables of uncertain identity, some barley, and what might be pieces of salt pork or might be the leather straps from someone's old shoes. It's genuinely hard to tell. You eat it anyway because you've walked approximately 15 miles today. Gilbert finally admitted the actual distance, and your body is demanding calories in any form. The monk leading the evening prayers afterward seems to be speed-running the liturgy, possibly because he's as exhausted as you are, or possibly because he's done the same routine for the 700th night in a row and knows nobody's really listening anyway. As you lay on your straw mattress, sandwiched between the praying woman and a snoring man who sounds like he's gargling gravel, you reflect on your first day of pilgrimage. Your feet are ruined. Your body aches in places you didn't know could ache. You smell like a combination of road dust, sweat, and someone else's dinner. Tomorrow promises more of the same, except your blisters will have blisters, and you'll be doing it all with even less enthusiasm. The truly horrifying realization hits you as you're drifting off to sleep to the symphony of 60 people breathing, snoring, coughing, and farting in a confined space. This was the easy day. This was the first day, when you were freshest, most motivated, and least damaged. Tomorrow will be worse. The day after that will be worse still. And you have weeks of this ahead of you, all for the privilege of touching a box containing the bones of a man who got murdered in his own cathedral nearly 200 years ago. Welcome to medieval pilgrimage. You're probably not going to make it. You wake to the sound of someone vomiting in the corner, which is honestly a more pleasant alarm than the church bells that follow immediately after. It's still dark because of course ice and your body responds to the concept of movement with a full symphony of pain. Every muscle has filed a grievance. Your feet, those former friends who used to carry you places without complaint, have apparently seceded from your body and formed their own nation of suffering. You try to stand and immediately understand why medieval people believed in demonic possession. Surely only an evil spirit could make a human body feel this comprehensively terrible. The hospice is already stirring with the kind of chaotic energy that comes from 60 people trying to pack their belongings in the dark while stepping on each other. Someone's knocked over a water pitcher. The praying woman from yesterday is praying even more intensely, possibly because she's realized what she's gotten herself into. The snoring man has evolved into a coughing man, producing sounds that suggest his lungs are auditioning for a role in a plague narrative. You gather your things, which takes approximately 30 seconds because you own almost nothing, and join the shuffling queue for the door. Outside, the pre-dawn air hits you like a cold, damp slap. Gilbert is already organizing the group, or trying to, while people mill about in the darkness looking for the latrine, which turns out to be a trench behind the building that redefines your understanding of the phrase Dark Ages. Medieval sanitation was essentially find a hole, use it, hope for the best. And this pilgrim hospice has clearly embraced that philosophy with enthusiasm. You do your business while trying not to think about the fact that you're essentially sharing this experience with everyone who's passed through here in the last several weeks. Breakfast is bread. Just bread. Not fresh bread. Not warm bread. Not even particularly good bread, just bread that exists in a state of being almost too hard to chew but not quite hard enough to use as a weapon. You gnaw on it while Gilbert announces today's plan. Rochester by nightfall, which is roughly another 15 miles. Someone asks about the route, and Gilbert waves vaguely southeast, which is either confidence or complete ignorance disguised as leadership. Historians still argue whether medieval guides actually knew the routes or just walked confidently in one direction until they found someone who did. And watching Gilbert, you're starting to suspect the latter. The group sets off just as the sky begins its slow transition from black to gray. That special English dawn that promises a day of weather that can't decide what it wants to be. Your feet immediately remind you of yesterday's damage. Each step is a negotiation between forward progress and screaming pain. The blisters from yesterday have ripened overnight into fluid-filled sacks of regret, and you're developing new ones in places you didn't know could blister. Between your toes, on your arch, on the top of your foot where the leather straps cut in. Your feet are basically a walking blister exhibition, and the museum doesn't close for weeks. The road today is somehow worse than yesterday's. Last night's rain, you slept through it, dead to the world in your exhaustion, has transformed the packed earth into a slick, sticky nightmare. The mud has the consistency of thick porridge and the grip of a needy relative who hasn't seen you in years. It sucks at your shoes with each step, making obscene squelching sounds that would be funny if they weren't so exhausting. You watch a wagon ahead lose a wheel in a particularly deep rut, and it takes an hour and 12 men to fix it, during which your group just stands there in the drizzle like the world's saddest parade. About 2 hours in, you notice the social dynamics of the pilgrimage group starting to solidify. Natural cliques are forming based on walking speed, social class, and shared misery. The wealthy merchant types cluster together, discussing business and periodically complaining about the accommodations in voices loud enough to ensure everyone knows they're slumming it. The poor pilgrims form their own group, bonded by the shared knowledge that this journey represents a massive portion of their yearly income and they absolutely cannot afford to fail or die. Then there are the weirdest flagellants, the extreme penitents, the people who seem to be enjoying this suffering and everyone gives them a wide berth. Your walking companion for the morning turns out to be a woman named Agnes who's on pilgrimage because she survived childbirth. which she explains was touch and go for a bit, what with the bleeding and the fever and the midwife's cat drinking the holy water. Medieval childbirth had a mortality rate of roughly 1 to 2%, which sounds low until you realize women typically had 5 to 7 children, making their lifetime odds of dying in childbirth somewhere around 10 to 15%. Agnes made it through alive and decided St. Thomas deserved a thank you visit, which seems like a lot of walking for a thank you, but medieval gratitude was apparently measured in blistered feet and months of hardship. She's also carrying her infant, yes, her actual baby strapped to her chest in a sling. You stare at this tiny creature, maybe 3 months old, who's about to walk 70 miles to Canterbury through medieval England's greatest hits of disease, danger, and discomfort. Couldn't leave him with anyone, Agnes explains cheerfully, and he's blessed by God to survive the birth, so he might as well see the saint what saved him. The baby, for his part, seems utterly unconcerned with the pilgrimage, sleeping through the walking, the mud, the chaos, living his best medieval infant life completely unaware that this is objectively insane. The professional pilgrim, John, remember him from yesterday with his cloak of 1,000 badges? Sidles up to your little group and starts offering advice that nobody asked for. Wear your shoes on opposite feet every other day. He suggests with the confidence of a man who's made this his entire personality. Balances the wear. See? And never drink from a stream with dead fish in it. That's bad luck. You want to point out that the dead fish are probably the least magical part of why you shouldn't drink that water. But he's already moved on to explaining his personal theory that St. Thomas can hear prayers better if you're walking uphill, which seems like theological nonsense designed to make suffering seem productive. Around mid-morning, you encounter your first real pilgrimage traffic jam. Another group, coming from a different direction and heading to Canterbury as well, converges with yours at a narrow bridge over a swollen stream. There are maybe 40 of them, led by a priest who immediately gets into a territorial dispute with Gilbert about who has right-of-way. The argument escalates quickly, involving religious authority, group size, and who started their pilgrimage first, as if St. Thomas maintains a strict appointment calendar. Medieval pilgrimage routes could get surprisingly crowded, especially during peak season spring and summer, when the roads were passable and the days long, creating bottlenecks at bridges, gates, and popular shrines that would make modern theme park queues look organized. You wait and wait. Your feet throb with each passing minute. The baby starts crying, which sets off a sympathetic crying response in several adults who are barely holding it together themselves. Eventually, someone suggests both groups just merge, which seems sensible until you realize you're now a procession of 100 people trying to coordinate movement, which is like herding cats, except the cats are in pain and some of them are carrying religious icons. The merged group is a snapshot of medieval society on the move. There's a knight doing penance for some unspecified sin that everyone assumes involves violence because, well, he's a knight. A group of nuns from a convent near London, walking with the kind of grim determination that suggests they'd rather be praying in silence, but obedience demanded they do this. Several merchants who've clearly confused pilgrimage with a business trip, conducting deals as they walk. A handful of peasants who saved for years for this journey, their rough wool clothes and calloused hands marking them as clearly as any badge. And then there's you, the modern person trapped in this medieval nightmare, wondering if St. Thomas accepts prayers along the lines of "Please let this be over soon." The priest leading the other group, Father Benedict, takes over from Gilbert without actually taking over, employing that special clerical passive aggression where he just starts making decisions and everyone follows because arguing with a priest feels like arguing with God's middle manager. He announces that you'll stop for prayers at the next wayside shrine, which turns out to be less than a mile ahead, a small stone cross decorated with wilted flowers and what might be blood. It's genuinely unclear. The shrine break involves everyone kneeling in the mud, yes. The mud, while Father Benedict leads prayers in Latin that flow over the group like verbal wallpaper. You kneel because everyone else is kneeling, and your knees immediately sink into the cold, wet earth, soaking through your hose in seconds. Medieval hose, by the way, were essentially tight leg coverings made of wool or linen, held up by being tied to your belt, and they were about as waterproof as a paper bag in a rainstorm. So now your feet hurt, your knees are wet, and you're praying to a saint you're not entirely sure you believe in for the strength to continue a journey you're not entirely sure you'll survive. After prayers, Father Benedict produces a relic, a small wooden box that he claims contains a thread from St. Thomas's vestments. People press forward to touch it, to kiss it, to hold it against their ailments and pray for healing. You watch a man with a pronounced limp touch the box to his leg and then walk away with the same limp, but somehow looking more hopeful, which is either the power of faith or the power of self-delusion. And honestly, in medieval pilgrimage culture, those were basically the same thing. The relic economy was huge in medieval Europe, with churches, monasteries, and private collectors owning pieces of saints, splinters of the true cross, vials of holy blood, and various body parts that may or may not have belonged to the holy people they were supposed to belong to. You're back on the road by noon, and the sun makes a rare appearance, which should improve morale but actually just makes everyone sweaty and irritable. The mud begins to dry into crusty patches that crack with each step, and dust rises from the road in choking clouds. You can't win. Medieval weather was basically a conspiracy against human comfort. Too wet, too dry, too cold, too hot, never just right. You're starting to understand why medieval people believed in divine punishment. This certainly feels like punishment for something. You're just not sure what. Lunch is eaten on the move because Father Benedict believes stopping shows weakness of spirit, which is easy to say when you're riding a donkey, which he is. Yes, the priest has a donkey. Nobody else has a donkey, just him. And he rides it with the smug satisfaction of a man who's found a theological loophole that allows him to preserve his feet while everyone else's feet become ground beef. Some pilgrims walk barefoot as extra penance, which seems like taking a bad situation and making it catastrophically worse. But medieval religious devotion had a competitive streak that modern people would find baffling. Your afternoon walking companion is a merchant named Thomas because apparently every third man in medieval England is named Thomas Hose on pilgrimage because he promised God he would if his shipment of wool made it safely to Flanders. He made a profit, and now he's walking to Canterbury to fulfill his vow, though he keeps checking the angle of the sun and muttering about lost business opportunities. He's doing the medieval version of working during vacation, composing letters in his head to business partners and calculating profit margins while walking through literal medieval sewage. You know what the worst part is? Thomas asks, not waiting for your answer. The shoes. These damn shoes. I paid good money for these 3 shillings, and they're falling apart already. You glance at his shoes, which do look slightly better than yours but are indeed beginning to separate at the seams. Medieval shoes for the wealthy might last a few months of regular wear, but pilgrimage wear was something else entirely. The constant walking, the mud, The wet, the dry, the rocks, the roots' shoes didn't stand a chance. Historians estimate that a pilgrim might go through 2 or 3 pairs of shoes on a long journey, which was a significant expense that many couldn't afford, leading to people walking in progressively more destroyed footwear until they were basically just wrapping their feet in leather scraps and hope. Around mid-afternoon, the group passes through a village that's clearly seen better days, which is saying something because these days are already pretty bad. Half the houses look abandoned, roofs collapsed, walls crumbling. An elderly woman sits outside one of the intact buildings, and as you pass, she calls out, "Turn back! Plague was here. Might still be here." The group doesn't exactly panic, but there's a definite acceleration of walking speed, people suddenly discovering energy they didn't have moments before. The Black Death had ravaged England in waves throughout the 1300s, and even decades later, plague could flare up in isolated outbreaks, turning villages into ghost towns overnight. Father Benedict leads the group in a hasty prayer against pestilence, which involves a lot of Latin and desperate hand gestures toward heaven. And everyone hustles through the village like it's on fire, which metaphorically kind of is. You don't see any obvious signs of plagano bodies. No buboes, no rats, well, no more rats than usual, but the fear is palpable. Medieval people understood that disease spread somehow, even if they got the mechanism hilariously wrong, blaming bad air, divine punishment, and Jewish people instead of, bacteria and fleas. Past the plague village, the landscape opens up into rolling hills that would be picturesque if you weren't climbing them on ruined feet. Each hill is a personal betrayal. The uphill portions make your legs burn and your lungs scream. The downhill portions somehow make your blisters worse and your knees feel like they're being slowly unscrewed. There's no good part of a hill when you're a medieval pilgrim. John the professional pilgrim chooses this moment to share his uphill prayer theory again, and several people look like they're considering pushing him down the hill as a practical experiment in gravity and divine intervention. You crest one particularly brutal hill and see Rochester in the valley below, its cathedral spire rising above the town like a stone middle finger to the landscape. Gilbert Howe's been unusually quiet since Father Benedict's effective coup announces that you should reach the town by Vespers, which is the evening prayer service and also apparently now a unit of time measurement. Medieval people told time by church servicesmatins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, which is incredibly confusing if you're not constantly tracking prayer schedules. But it's the system you're stuck with. The final approach to Rochester is when disaster strikes. Not for you, thankfully, but for a young man near the front of the group. He steps wrong a rock, a root, a rut, something, and his ankle makes a sound like a green stick snapping. He goes down hard, screaming in a way that makes everyone's blood run cold. The group stops, clusters around him, and you see his ankle already swelling, the foot at an angle that feet definitely should not be at. Father Benedict examines him with the confidence of someone who has no medical training but feels obligated to look authoritative. Broken, he announces, which, yes, obviously, thank you for the diagnosis, Father. The question is what to do about it. Medieval medicine for broken bones ranged from splint it and hope, to apply increasingly bizarre poultices and hope, to pray and hope. And you're sensing a theme here. The young man, through his tears and pain, begs not to be left behind, which is heartbreaking because everyone knows that's exactly what's about to happen. A debate erupts. Some argue for carrying him to Rockestritz only 2 miles, while others point out that the group can't slow down for an injury. That pilgrimage is already hard enough. Father Benedict suggests leaving him with money for a local healer, which assumes they'll find a local healer who isn't a scam artist or a butcher practicing medicine on the side. The knight offers to pay for the man's care, which seems generous until you remember he's on a penance pilgrimage for unspecified violent sins, and this is probably just guilt talking. Eventually, they fashion a rough stretcher from cloaks and walking staffs, and 4 men volunteer to carry the injured pilgrim to Rochester. Rotating shifts. It slows the group significantly, but at least nobody's being left in a ditch, which is apparently the medieval equivalent of ethical high ground. You help carry for 1 shift, and your shoulders immediately file a complaint to join the grievance your feet already submitted. The young man moans with each jostle, apologizing between groans, and you realize this injury might have just ended his pilgrimage before it really began. Rochester comes into view properly as the sun starts its descent. The town walls visible, smoke from cooking fires rising in the evening air. The group's energy picks up despite the exhaustion shelter. Food, rest. These concepts have taken on almost mythical significance. You limp through the town gates, past guards who barely glance at your ragged procession because apparently suffering pilgrims are just Thursday in Rochester. The pilgrim hospice here is attached to the cathedral priory, a more substantial building than Dartford's, and the monk who greets you has the weary patience of someone managing a medieval holiday inn on the pilgrimage route. "We have room for 50, he announces, and your heart sinks because your group is 100 strong. The sorting begins immediately. Old and infirm get priority, then families, then those who can pay extra donations, and finally, whoever fits. You make the cut again, though barely, and file into another communal sleeping hall. This one is slightly better, actual wooden bed frames with straw mattresses instead of just straw on the floor, but it's still 60 strangers sharing space. Smells, and probably diseases. The injured young man is carried to a corner and tended by the priory's infirmarian, a monk who actually seems to know what he's doing, setting the ankle with practiced efficiency and a concerning amount of force that makes the young man scream again. Dinner is pottage again, but this batch has actual visible chunks of meat, probably mutton, possibly pork, conceivably rat. You're too hungry to care, and bread that's merely stale rather than weaponizable. The monks lead evening prayers, and this time, people actually participate with feeling, grateful for shelter, praying for strength, or just too tired to resist. You mumble along, your Latin pronunciation probably offensive to St. Thomas and God himself, but figuring that effort counts for something. As you settle onto your bed frame luxury, you perform the nightly ritual of examining your feet. They're worse than yesterday. The original blisters have popped, leaving raw, weeping patches. New blisters have formed. Your toenails are black with bruising. One toe has swollen to twice its normal size for reasons you don't understand and probably don't want to. This is day 2. Day 2 of what might be weeks. The math is horrifying. Agnes and her baby are nearby, and the infant is crying with the persistent intensity of a creature who's probably uncomfortable, possibly hungry, and definitely unimpressed with pilgrimage accommodations. Agnes rocks him, hums a melody that's probably a lullaby but sounds like a dirge at this hour, and you wonder again at the absolute medieval audacity of bringing a baby on this journey. But then you remember that medieval people brought babies everywhere, to markets, to fields, to wars, to pilgrimages because childcare as a separate concept didn't really exist. You just strapped the kid to you and got on with your suffering. The merchant Thomas is calculating something on a wax tablet, still working, still planning, probably figuring out if the spiritual benefits of this pilgrimage outweigh the financial costs. The praying woman is, predictably, praying. The coughing man is now the coughing and wheezing man, his breathing a rattling symphony that suggests his pilgrimage might end in a different kind of shrine than he planned. John the professional pilgrim is regaling a group with stories of his many journeys, and you suspect half of them are lies, but you're too exhausted to call him out. Tomorrow promises more of the same. Walking, pain, mud or dust depending on the weather's mood, bad food, worse accommodations, and the slow realization that medieval pilgrimage is basically just suffering with a religious excuse. Your feet throb, your legs ache, your back hurts, everything hurts, and you have at least 5 more days of walking ahead of you, assuming nothing goes catastrophically wrong, which, given the pattern so far, seems like optimistic thinking. Welcome to day 2. You're still not going to make it. You're awakened by the pre-dawn chorus of someone's digestive system staging a violent rebellion, followed by the now familiar sprint to the latrine that didn't make it in time. The smell that follows is immediate and comprehensive, and you understand why medieval people believed in divine punishment. Surely only cosmic retribution could create this specific combination of sensory horrors before sunrise. Your body, meanwhile, has apparently spent the night calcifying into a single solid mass of pain, and the simple act of sitting up requires a level of willpower you didn't know you possessed. The hospice is already stirring with the resigned energy of people who know what's coming and can't avoid it. Father Benedict is loudly leading morning prayers, his voice cutting through the groans and coughs like a holy alarm clock nobody asked for. You mumble responses automatically, your brain still mostly asleep, your feet already filing their morning complaint before you've even stood up. When you finally do stand, your legs briefly consider simply not working, trembling like a newborn foal's before reluctantly accepting their fate. Breakfast is, you guessed it, bread. But this morning there's also something the monks call potage, which is basically yesterday's dinner leftovers thinned with water and served cold, because apparently the concept of reheating food hasn't been invented, or, more likely, requires effort the monks aren't willing to expend at 4 in the morning. You eat it anyway, spooning the gray slop into your mouth while trying not to think about what might be in it. Medieval food preservation was an adventure in controlled decay, and you're starting to understand why saints who performed food-related miracles were so popular. The injured young man from yesterday is being left behind, as everyone knew he would be. The priory's infirmarian has agreed to care for him for a fee that the knight paid, plus additional alms from those who feel guilty about abandoning him. The young man cries as the group prepares to leave, not from pain but from the realization that his pilgrimage is over, his vow unfulfilled, his salvation uncertain. Medieval people genuinely believed that completing a pilgrimage could reduce their time in purgatory, heal their ailments, or absolve them of sins. So failing to reach the shrine wasn't just disappointing, it was spiritually catastrophic. Father Benedict offers some consoling words about God understanding and intention counting as much as completion, which sounds nice but probably doesn't hold up in medieval theological court. You set out into the darkness because of course you Dowith Rochester's gates barely visible behind you and approximately 12 miles to Canterbury ahead. 12 miles. It sounds so manageable when you say it quickly, but your feet know better. Your feet are medieval pilgrimage veterans now, hardened by 2 days of suffering, and they're already screaming their objections before you've cleared the town walls. The blisters have evolved into something beyond blisters open sores. Really, weeping fluid that soaks into your bandages and makes every step a fresh negotiation with pain. The road today is different, narrower, winding through wooded areas that seem designed to harbor bandits and general medieval unpleasantness. Father Benedict announces this is the old Roman road to Canterbury, which sounds historical and important until you realize the Romans built it roughly 300 years ago and nobody's maintained it since. The stones they laid are still visible in places, broken and scattered like a failed game of giant dominoes, creating a surface that's somehow worse than just mud because now you get to trip on ancient infrastructure. About an hour in, your group encounters the first real pilgrim amenity of the journey, a proper pilgrim inn. Not a hospice run by monks with their vows of poverty and enthusiasm for discomfort, but an actual commercial establishment designed to extract money from desperate travelers. It's called the 3 Crowns, and a painted sign shows 3 crowns that look more like 3 blobs. But honestly, medieval art wasn't known for its realism. The innkeeper stands outside, a rotund man with the calculating eyes of someone who knows exactly how much suffering people will pay to avoid. Rooms available. He shouts at your procession. Clean beds. Hot food. Only 2 pence per person. 2 pence is about 2 days' wages for a laborer, which is to say, obscenely expensive. But clean beds and hot food sound like paradise after 2 nights in communal suffering, and you watch several of the wealthier pilgrims peel off from the group, their coins speaking louder than their commitment to shared hardship. The merchant Thomas is among them, and he doesn't even have the decency to look guilty about it, just waves cheerfully and disappears into the inn like a man who's remembered he has options. The rest of you continue on, and you can feel the morale shift. Those who couldn't afford the inn now feel poorer, more committed to suffering, and slightly resentful of those who could. Medieval pilgrimage was supposed to be equalizing rich and poor walking together toward salvation, but money still bought comfort, and everyone knew it. Historians still argue whether this undermined the spiritual purpose of pilgrimage or just reflected the inescapable reality of economic hierarchy. But from your position as someone whose feet are currently bleeding into inadequate shoes, you're leaning toward the whole system is rigged. Your new walking companion for the morning is one of the nuns, Sister Margaret, who has the kind of serene expression that suggests either deep faith or complete dissociation from reality. She walks with a measured pace, hands folded, lips moving in constant silent prayer, occasionally stopping to cross herself at particularly pious-looking trees. Do you find the journey brings you closer to God? She asks, and you're tempted to answer honestly that mostly it's brought you closer to understanding why medieval people had such vivid concepts of hell, but instead, you mumble something non-committal about spiritual growth. Sister Margaret interprets your mumbling as profound agreement and launches into a detailed explanation of her convent's particular devotional practices, which apparently involve a lot of kneeling, self-flagellation, and eating nothing but bread and water on holy days, which is basically every 3rd day because medieval Christianity found holy days the way modern people find sales at their favorite stores constantly and everywhere. She's on this pilgrimage because her Mother Superior ordered it as penance for excessive pride in her humility, which is such a medieval problem that you almost laugh, except laughing would require energy you don't have. Around mid-morning, the group stops at a wayside shrine that's more elaborate than the previous Onisa small stone structure with a roof, containing what's claimed to be a statue of the Virgin Mary that once wept real tears. The statue looks like most medieval religious art, vaguely human-shaped, painted in colors that have faded to shades of, maybe this was blue once, with eyes that either gaze heavenward in devotion or just weren't carved to look in any particular direction. It's hard to say. Father Benedict leads prayers, and people press forward to touch the statue, to leave small offerings, flowers, coins, strips of clothing, hopes of blessings, healing, or at least not dying on the road. You notice that someone's left a pilgrim badge at the shrine, which strikes you as backward-shouldered. You collect badges, not leave them. But then John the professional pilgrim explains that leaving a badge from a previous pilgrimage is a way of asking that saint to intercede with the saint you're currently visiting, essentially creating a holy networking system. It's all about connections, John says with the enthusiasm of someone who's turned religious devotion into a multilevel marketing scheme. St. Thomas knows St. Mary. St. Mary knows St. Peter. St. Peter's got God's ear, you just gotta work the system. The path narrows further, and the forest closes in, creating a tunnel of trees that blocks the weak sunlight and turns the road into a shadowy corridor that definitely looks like where bandits would hang out if they were choosing locations for ambushing pilgrims. Father Benedict tries to keep spirits up by leading the group in hymns, which might work better if anyone knew all the words or could carry a tune. Instead, you get an off-key chorus of Salve Regina that sounds less like sacred music and more like what happens when you tell 100 tired, tone-deaf people to sing in Latin. Around noon, your worst fears are confirmed when a group of men step out onto the road ahead. There are maybe 8 of them, armed with clubs, knives, and one actual sword, which in medieval terms means they're either bandits or just regular poor people who've decided banditry pays better than farming. Their leader, a scarred man with the posture of someone who's done this before, plants himself in the middle of the road and announces, "Pilgrims, the road ahead requires a toll for safe passage. 1 penny per person, and nobody gets hurt." The irony of being robbed on a holy pilgrimage is not lost on anyone, but medieval bandits specifically targeted pilgrims because they knew pilgrims carried their savings with them. You need money for food, lodging, offerings at the shrine, and the return journey. Father Benedict, to his credit, steps forward with surprising courage or possibly stupidity. "We are pilgrims under God's protection," he proclaims, "and to rob us is to rob the church itself." The bandits seem unmoved by this theological argument, probably because they're aware that God's protection doesn't typically include physical intervention against clubs. A tense negotiation ensues. The bandits want a penny per person. Father Benedict offers prayers for their souls. The bandits counter with half a penny per person and the group spare food. The knight remember him, doing penance for violent sins, fingering his sword, clearly calculating whether fighting 8 bandits would add to or subtract from his spiritual debt. Eventually, they settle on a collective payment of 20 pennies from the whole group, which people scrape together from their travel funds with varying degrees of resentment. You contribute your halfpenny, watching as the bandits count the coins with the practiced efficiency of small business owners, which, in a weird way, they are. Medieval banditry was often just another economic activity, with some bandits maintaining regular tax systems on popular routes, essentially running protection rackets that everyone understood and no one could stop. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were pure extortion or a kind of privatized road security. But from your perspective as someone who just paid to not get clubbed, the distinction feels academic. The bandits let you pass with cheerful waves, and you understand the absurdity of medieval crime. These men just robbed you, but they're polite about it, wishing you well on your pilgrimage like your neighbors who just borrowed sugar. One of them even calls out, "Say a prayer for us at the shrine," which is either sincere faith or just really committed irony. The afternoon stretch feels longer, heavier, weighed down by the robbery and the growing reality that you're genuinely vulnerable out here. The forest continues, dense and dark, and every shadow looks like another bandit waiting to happen. Agnes clutches her baby closer, and you notice she's walking faster, as if speed could somehow protect them. The baby, oblivious to the danger, has woken up and is making those little baby noises that are objectively cute but also seem really loud when you're trying not to attract attention from forest criminals. Sister Margaret responds to the trauma by praying louder, which seems counterproductive from a don't announce your location standpoint, but she's convinced that vocal prayer creates a protective barrier against evil. Several other pilgrims join her, creating a walking prayer circle that's either spiritually powerful or just really annoying depending on your perspective. You're too tired to decide, so you just walk and try to ignore the competing sounds of prayer, baby gurgles, and your own feet making squelching sounds in your blood-soaked bandages. Around mid-afternoon, the forest finally opens up, and you see farmland again, which feels safer even though logically, bandits could attack in a field just as easily as in a forest. But there's something about open space and distant workers that suggests civilization. Rules, consequences for crime, all illusions, probably, but comforting ones. The road improves slightly too, becoming a proper track again, and you make better time despite everyone's exhaustion. You pass through a village called something Ford or something Hem, because medieval English villages were named with the creativity of people who just pointed at geographic features and added suffixes. The locals stare at your procession with that peculiar mix of piety and opportunism that you've come to recognize. A woman sells blessed water that's probably from the well behind her house. A man offers to sharpen pilgrims' knives, which seems like preparing for the wrong kind of pilgrimage activity. Children beg, dogs bark, pigs root around in the street, and medieval village life continues exactly as it has for centuries, indifferent to your personal suffering. Father Benedict announces a meal stop, and you collapse at the roadside with the grace of a dropped sack of grain. Your feet have transcended pain and entered some kind of numb acceptance, which is either a good sign or means they've given up entirely. You unwrap your bandages to assess the damage and immediately regret if sores are infected, showing the telltale signs of redness and swelling. Medieval infection treatment consisted mostly of prayer and increasingly desperate poultices, and you have neither medical supplies nor much faith that prayer will regrow skin tissue. John the professional pilgrim appears, because of course he does, with his bag of questionable remedies. Infected feet? I've got just the tina poultice of bread, milk, and spider webs. Very effective, very traditional. You're about to refuse when you remember that spider webs actually do have some antimicrobial properties, not because medieval people understood germ theory, but because they tried everything and occasionally stumbled onto something that worked. You let him apply his disgusting paste to your feet, and it feels exactly as awful as it sounds, but slightly less awful than the infections, so you'll take it. Lunch is your personal supply of food, which has dwindled alarmingly. You do the math. You've eaten for 3 days, you have maybe 2 days of food left, and you're still not at Canterbury. The plan was to buy food along the way, but after the bandit toll, Your funds are lower than expected. And medieval inflation on pilgrimage routes was real prices doubled or tripled near popular shrines because vendors knew pilgrims were literally a captive market. You eat half of what you want to eat, saving the rest, and your stomach immediately files a complaint. The afternoon walking is when the hallucinations start. Not for you yet, but for one of the elderly pilgrims, a man who's been struggling since day one. He starts talking to people who aren't there, pointing at the sky and describing angels, falling to his knees to worship a tree he's convinced is the Virgin Mary. Medieval people would have interpreted this as either divine visions or demonic possession, but you suspect it's dehydration, exhaustion, possibly fever, and the psychological strain of pushing a body beyond its limits. Father Benedict performs what he calls an examination of spirits to determine if the visions are holy or hellish, which involves asking the old man questions in Latin and interpreting his confused mumbling as theological evidence. It's absolutely not scientific, completely unreliable, and ultimately concludes that the visions are probably divine but possibly just fatigue, which is medieval diagnosis at its finest decisive uncertainty. They let the old man rest while the group debates what to do. Some want to leave him in the next village with money for care, like the injured young man. Others argue he'll recover with rest and should continue. The old man himself insists his visions are real and that St. Thomas himself appeared to tell him to keep walking, which is either genuine religious experience or exactly what someone who doesn't want to be abandoned would say. Eventually, they decide to let him continue but keep close watch, which basically means waiting for him to either recover or collapse more definitively. As the sun begins its descent, Canterbury finally comes into view in the distance. You can see the cathedral spire rising above the city walls, taller and grander than Rochester's, and despite everything, the pain, the exhaustion, the infections, the robbery, the existential dread, there's a moment of genuine emotion. You're almost there. 3 days of walking, countless blisters, 1 bandit attack, 2 mysterious infections, and several spiritual crises, and you can actually see your destination. The group's energy picks up immediately, people walking faster despite their injuries, talking excitedly about finally reaching the shrine, about completing their pilgrimage, about the salvation that awaits. Father Benedict leads a hymn of thanksgiving that people actually sing with feeling this time, their voices carrying across the fields toward the distant city. Even you feel it, not religious ecstasy, exactly, but the simple human relief of seeing a finish line after a marathon you never wanted to run. But here's the thing about medieval pilgrimages that nobody mentions in the cheerful moments. Reaching Canterbury doesn't mean the journey is over. You still have to navigate the city, find lodging, wait for your turn at the shrine because yes, there's a queue. This is England. Perform whatever religious observations are required, and then somehow make the return journey home with even less money and probably worse feet. The cathedral spire in the distance isn't the end. It's just the middle. You limp toward Canterbury as the sun sets, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would be beautiful if you had any energy left to appreciate beauty. Your feet are wrapped in bandages and spider web paste. Your legs feel like they've been beaten with clubs, which, given the bandit encounter, isn't far from the truth. Your spirit is somewhere between broken and stubbornly refusing to quit. And tomorrow, you'll wake up and realize that all of this suffering was just to reach a city where you'll stand in line to touch a box containing the bones of a dead archbishop. Medieval pilgrimage, where the journey is suffering, the destination is a queue, and the souvenirs are infections and spiritual ambiguity. Welcome to day 3. You're still not going to make it, but at least you can see where you're not going to make it to. You wake in a pilgrim hostel on the outskirts of Canterbury, and the first thing you notice is that someone has died in the night. Not dramaticalino screaming, no final prayers, just the quiet, unspectacular way medieval people often died, slipping away while everyone else snored around them. It's the old man with the visions, his body already cooling in the corner, and the monk running this particular establishment is treating it with the bureaucratic efficiency of someone who's dealt with this exact situation dozens of times. We'll see to the burial, he announces to no one in particular. His belongings will go to the church. Please be out by prime. The casual nature of the death is somehow more disturbing than if there'd been drama. Medieval mortality was just ambient background noise. People died constantly, unexpectedly, and everyone just moved on. The group offers brief prayers for the old man's soul, several people crossing themselves, and then you're all filing out into the pre-dawn darkness because the hostel needs to make room for tonight's batch of dying pilgrims. You never even learned the old man's name. He walked beside you for 3 days, had divine visions or fever dreams, and died within sight of his spiritual goal. And he remains as anonymous in death as he was in life. Canterbury's gates open at dawn, and your group is among the first to enter, joining a flow of pilgrims that's apparently constant. The city is bigger than London felt, more organized, with streets that are actually somewhat planned rather than the organic chaos of most medieval towns. But organized is relative. There's still mud, still wandering livestock, still the overwhelming smell of a medieval city where sanitation means throw it in the street and hope it rains. The difference is that here, everything is geared toward pilgrims. Every third building is an inn, a hospice, a shop selling religious items, or a tavern offering authentic Canterbury Alesh blessed by monks, which is definitely just regular ale with creative marketing. Father Benedict leads the group toward the cathedral, but the streets are already packed with other pilgrims, creating a traffic jam of piety. There are groups from all over England, some from France, a few claiming to have come from as far as Scotland, all converging on the shrine of St. Thomas Becket like medieval religious tourists. You see pilgrims in various states of devotion and distress, some walking on their knees, bloodying the cobblestones in extreme penance, others being carried on stretchers, too sick or injured to walk but determined to reach the shrine before death reaches them, and plenty who just look tired, like you, wondering if this spiritual journey was really worth it. The shrine opens for pilgrims at terce. Father Benedict announces, which is roughly 9 in the morning, which means you have about 3 hours to kill. 3 hours might not sound like much, but when you're running on medieval time with infected feet and the emotional baggage of watching a man die, it feels eternal. The group disperses, some to find breakfast, others to explore the city, a few to the cathedral to pray at the lesser altars while waiting for main shrine access. You end up at a pilgrim market near the cathedral, a chaotic bazaar selling everything a medieval spiritual tourist could want. There are pilgrim badges, of course, dozens of vendors hawking pewter tokens stamped with Thomas Becket's image, his martyrdom scene, the cathedral itself. Prices range from a halfpenny for crude badges to several pennies for elaborate ones with detailed engravings. You watch people bargaining with the intensity of shoppers at a modern Black Friday sale, haggling over the spiritual value of slightly different saint portraits. One vendor is selling what he claims are authentic relics from St. Thomas himself, vials of water supposedly mixed with the saint's blood, scraps of cloth allegedly from his vestments, even a small bone fragment that he swears came from the saint's finger. The prices are astronomical, several shillings for the bone fragment, and you're absolutely certain they're fake. The relic market in medieval Europe was notoriously fraudulent, with vendors selling enough pieces of the true cross to build a forest and enough saint bones to fill a cathedral's worth of crypts. But people are buying anyway, their faith stronger than their skepticism. Or perhaps they just want proof they were here, even if the proof is a probable chicken bone in a fancy box. Another section of the market sells practical goods shoes, because everyone's shoes are destroyed, walking staffs to replace broken ones, food for the journey home, and medicine, which is mostly herbs that may or may not do anything, sold by people with no medical training whatsoever. You see someone buying a cure for foot sores. That's basically just lard mixed with crushed flowers. And you think about your spiderweb poultice and realize medieval medicine was just trying things and hoping, which is either optimistic or desperate depending on your perspective. There's also entertainment, a juggler performing tricks while singing hymns, creating a weird hybrid of holy and festive. A storyteller recounting Thomas Becket's martyrdom with dramatic flourishes and probably several invented details. And a man with a performing monkey, which seems thematically inappropriate for a religious pilgrimage but is drawing a crowd nonetheless. Medieval pilgrimages were part spiritual journey, part carnival, and the line between sacred and secular was basically just a suggestion that everyone ignored when money was involved. Agnes finds you at the market, her baby strapped to her chest as always, and she's clutching a pilgrim badge she just bought with obvious pride. "For my son," she explains, "so he'll remember he was here, even if he won't remember being here. You know? The logic is circular but somehow touching. This desire to mark the journey, to have proof of suffering and devotion. You buy a badge to a simple one. Cheap, just Thomas Becket's head in profile, not because you particularly want it, but because it feels like you've come too far not to have something to show for it." Around mid-morning, the cathedral bells ring for terce, and the pilgrim crowd surges toward the cathedral entrance like medieval shoppers storming a sale. There's no orderly queue, no ticket system, just a mass of humanity pushing toward the doors with the desperation of people who've walked for days or weeks for this moment. You're swept along in the crowd, pressed between bodies that haven't seen soap in weeks, breathing air that's thick with sweat, incense, and unwashed wool. The cathedral interior is overwhelming. It's vast, cavernous, with soaring stone arches that seem to reach toward heaven itself. Stained glass windows casting colored light across the stone floor, and everywhere are pilgrims. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, filling the nave, the aisles, the transepts, creating a human river flowing toward the shrine. The noise is incredible prayers in multiple languages. Crying, singing, the shuffle of feet, the echo of it all bouncing off stone walls designed to amplify God's glory but currently just amplifying chaos. Father Benedict has lost control of your group entirely. You're all separated in the crush, individuals now rather than a cohesive party, each person pursuing their own spiritual transaction with St. Thomas. You spot Sister Margaret being swept toward a side chapel, her serene expression finally cracking into something like panic. The merchant Thomas is nowhere to be seen, probably having paid for special access because of course rich people get to skip the queue even in medieval churches. You inch forward with the crowd, and it takes an hura full hor to move maybe 30 feet. The shrine is at the far end of the cathedral, behind the high altar, in a specially built chapel called the Trinity Chapel, and the approach is controlled by monks who are trying to manage the flow of pilgrims with all the success of people trying to organize a flood. They're shouting instructions in Latin that nobody understands or follows, occasionally physically pushing pilgrims back when the crush gets dangerous, and generally looking like they regret their vocational choices. The atmosphere is strange devotional, but also almost competitive. Pilgrims are jockeying for position, trying to get closer, to touch the shrine sooner, to have more time with the saint. You see people praying desperately, crying, one woman literally crawling on her knees across the stone floor, leaving a trail of blood. Medieval pilgrimage brought out both the best and worst of humanity, genuine faith alongside naked self-interest, devotion mixed with superstition, and everywhere, the transactional nature of medieval Christianity where suffering plus money could supposedly purchase salvation. You finally reach the shrine area after another hour of shuffling forward, and here's where things get truly medieval. The shrine itself, the actual tomb of Thomas Beketes encased in an elaborate structure of gold, precious stones, and more wealth than most people will see in 10 lifetimes. It's obscenely opulent, a glittering monument to a martyred archbishop, and it's surrounded by iron railings to keep pilgrims from getting too close or, more likely, from stealing pieces of it. The irony of a shrine to a saint who criticized church wealth being literally covered in gold and jewels is apparently lost on everyone but you. But here's the thing medieval pilgrims actually interact with. It's not the golden shrine that's just for looking at it, a wooden canopy below it, where monks have placed containers of Canterbury water, which is water supposedly mixed with a dilution of Thomas Becket's blood. Yes, blood. Or what's claimed to be blood but is probably just water with red dye. But nobody's checking the provenance too carefully because faith doesn't require evidence, just conviction. Pilgrims are pressing forward to touch the canopy, to apply the Canterbury water to their ailments, to leave offerings of coins, jewelry, even crutches from people claiming to be healed. You watch a paralyzed man walk away from the shrine, his family shouting about a miracle, and you genuinely can't tell if it's faith healing, psychosomatic response, or a very committed scam. Medieval medicine was so ineffective that any improvement, real or imagined, could seem miraculous, and the church was happy to claim credit regardless. Your turn finally comes, and a monk looking absolutely exhausted gestures you forward. You're supposed to kneel, pray, touch the shrine or apply the water, make an offering, and move along quickly because there are approximately 10,000 people behind you. You kneel, your infected feet screaming their objections, and you look up at this golden monument to medieval faith. What do you pray for? Healing? Salvation? Just surviving the journey home? You settle on something simple. Please let my feet not fall off. It's not particularly spiritual, but it's honest, and if God or St. Thomas is listening, they probably appreciate the directness. You touch the wooden canopy, it's smooth, worn by thousands of hands before yours, and a monk applies a drop of Canterbury water to your forehead with the efficiency of someone on an assembly line. The water is cold, slightly oily, and definitely not magical, but the ritual completion feels significant nonetheless. You're supposed to leave an offering, and you place your last 2 pennies in the offering box, which represents most of your remaining money but also feels necessary. You can't come all this way and cheap out at the actual shrine, that's just bad spiritual economics. As you stand to leave, making room for the next pilgrim, You feel not transformed, not healed, not suddenly filled with divine grace, but perhaps slightly lighter. Maybe it's psychological relief at completing the pilgrimage's main objective. Maybe it's just physical relief at standing up. Or maybe there's something to this whole pilgrimage thing after all. You exit the shrine area into the ambulatory, the walkway behind the high altar, and immediately encounter the aftermath of the pilgrimage experience. People crying, people laughing, people looking confused and slightly disappointed, and people already haggling with monks about buying official certificates proving they completed the pilgrimage. Yes, certificates, because apparently, even in medieval times, if you didn't document your achievement, did it really happen? The certificates are written in Latin on parchment, stamped with the cathedral's seal, and cost about as much as you just spent on your offering, which you can no longer afford. You find Agnes in the ambulatory, her baby somehow sleeping through all this chaos, and she's clutching a small vial of Canterbury water that a monk sold her for 3 pennies. For the baby, she says, to protect him. You don't have the heart to tell her it's probably just water, possibly not even from Canterbury, because her faith in it is real even if the water's provenance is questionable. Medieval parenting involved a lot of hoping blessed objects would protect your children because actual medicine was basically useless. John the professional pilgrim appears. Where does he keep coming from? And he's already wearing his new Canterbury badge prominently on his cloak, adding to his collection like a Boy Scout of medieval devotion. 17th time, he says with obvious pride, never gets old. Well, it does get old, but that's sort of the point, isn't it? Suffering, devotion, salvation, the whole package. He's bought 3 extra badges to sell at his next pilgrimage destination, because apparently you can arbitrage pilgrim merchandise, and John has turned religious tourism into a full-time hustle. Father Benedict manages to gather most of the group back together in the nave, and he announces that there's an afternoon service where pilgrims can receive a special blessing from one of the cathedral canons. It's optional, but recommended, and also there's a suggested donation, which is medieval speak for not really optional. Those who can afford it stay, those who can't slip away quietly, and you watch the economic stratification of salvation play out in real time as the wealthy pilgrims move toward the special blessing and the poor ones head toward the exits. You stay, not because you can afford the donation you can't, but because after walking 70 miles with infected feet and watching a man die for this, you might as well get the full experience. The blessing involves more Latin, more incense, and a canon who performs the ritual with the enthusiasm of someone who's done this twice daily for years. But when he traces the sign of the cross over the assembled pilgrims and says, "May St. Thomas intercede for you, and may your journey home be safe," there's a moment of genuine communal feeling, this shared experience of suffering and seeking that transcends the commercial aspects. After the blessing, the reality hits. You have to go home. The pilgrimage isn't over, it's only half done. You have 70 miles to walk back to London with worse feet, less money, no food supplies, and the knowledge that the return journey is historically where most pilgrims died. The shrine was the climax, but the denouement is going to be brutal. The group's dissolution is immediate and unceremonious. The wealthy pilgrims are staying in Canterbury for a few days, resting, sightseeing, treating it like a medieval vacation. The nuns are heading to their convent near Dover, a different direction entirely. The knight has apparently decided his penance is complete and is simply riding home on a horse he somehow acquired, which seems like cheating, but medieval nobility played by different rules. Father Benedict is staying to perform additional prayers and, you suspect, to avoid the walk back. You find yourself among the remnant maybe 20 pilgrims who need to return to London immediately because they can't afford to stay and they have lives, jobs, and responsibilities waiting. No leader, no priest, no wealthy patron, just people whose spiritual journey is now colliding with economic reality. Someone suggests grouping together for safety, which makes sense given the bandits, and an informal agreement forms. You'll leave tomorrow morning, travel together, and hope that 20 pilgrims are less appetizing targets than individuals. The afternoon is spent preparing for the return journey with the resources you don't have. You need food. You buy a loaf of bread and some hard cheese with the last of your money, calculating that it'll last maybe 3 days if you're careful. You need better bandages. You steal some cloth from a market stall when the vendor isn't looking, because apparently pilgrimage doesn't preclude petty theft when necessity calls. You need rest. You find a corner in a crowded pilgrim hospice and collapse, your body finally processing the last 4 days of abuse. As you lie there, listening to the sounds of Canterbury's pilgrimage industry continuing, outside vendors shouting, pilgrims praying, bells ringing, you realize that the spiritual transformation you were supposed to experience feels distant, theoretical. What you have instead is practical knowledge, your body's limits, the economic reality of medieval travel, the complex mix of faith and commerce that drives pilgrimage culture, and the certainty that medieval people were simultaneously more devout and more pragmatic than modern people imagine. The shrine visit was supposed to be transcendent, life-changing, soul-altering. Instead, it was crowded, commercial, and weirdly anticlimactic, not because St. Thomas isn't real or miracles don't happen, but because the human experience of pilgrimage is messy, uncomfortable, and often disappointing in ways that medieval people probably didn't talk about but definitely experienced. Historians still argue whether medieval pilgrims genuinely achieved spiritual transformation or just convinced themselves they did to justify the suffering. But from your position as someone whose feet are wrapped in stolen cloth and whose salvation is uncertain, the question feels academic. Tomorrow, you walk home. The shrine is touched. The prayers are said. The badge is purchased. You're officially a Canterbury pilgrim now, which means you've suffered appropriately and paid enough money to maybe, possibly, potentially have reduced your time in purgatory. Or you've just walked 70 miles to touch a box. Medieval faith requires not asking that question too directly. Welcome to the spiritual climax of your journey. It was crowded, expensive, and your feet still hurt. At least you got a badge. You wake in the Canterbury hospice to discover that your informal travel group has already lost 3 members who decided during the night that they'd rather try their luck alone or stay longer in the city. Economic reality be damned. The remaining 17 pilgrims gather in the pre-dawn darkness with the resigned energy of people starting a journey they've already completed once. Except this time they're poorer, more damaged, and have no spiritual goal to motivate them, just the mundane necessity of getting home before they starve or their families assume they're dead. Your new companions are a cross-section of medieval England's struggling classes. 2 brothers who work as dyers in London and smell permanently of urine and chemicals. A widow returning to her village near Southwark. A carpenter who's clearly regretting his vow to walk to Canterbury barefoot. His feet look like raw meat wrapped in determination. A baker, a fishmonger, and a handful of laborers whose specific trades you never learn because medieval introductions didn't include the social niceties of LinkedIn profiles. There's no leader, no priest, No Gilbert or Father Benedict to organize things. Just people who need to go roughly the same direction and figure safety in numbers is worth the coordination headaches. The group's first decision leaving at dawn or waiting for full light immediately sparks an argument. The Dyers want to leave now to maximize walking time. The widow insists waiting is safer because bandits prefer darkness. The carpenter can't walk fast anyway, so timing is irrelevant to him. Eventually, you all just start walking because making decisions by committee is terrible in any century, and at least moving forward feels like progress even if you haven't agreed on anything. Canterbury's gates are already open, and you're among dozens of pilgrims streaming out in various directions, some toward London like you, others toward Dover and the ports, a few heading north toward different shrines because apparently some people are pilgrimage completists who can't visit just one saint. The roads diverge quickly, and your group finds itself on what someone claims is the London Road, though nobody seems entirely certain, and medieval signage consisted mostly of hoping you'd recognize landmarks from the trip out. Within an hour, you realize the return journey has a fundamentally different character. Going to Canterbury, you were propelled by purpose, anticipation, the promise of spiritual reward. Returning, you're just tired people walking away from something that's already done. And the motivation is purely negative: avoid starvation. Don't die. Get home. It's the difference between vacation and commute, and your body knows it, protesting the renewed abuse with creative variations on pain you didn't know existed. Your traveling companion for the morning is the widow, Eleanor, who fills the silence with stories about her husband, a fisherman who drowned last year, leaving her with 3 children and debts she's trying to pray away through pilgrimage. Thomas Becket was murdered too, she explains, so he understands violent death, understands widows. I prayed for him to intercede, to help with the debts, to keep the children fed. You ask if she feels her prayers were heard, and she gives you a look that suggests the question itself is beside the point. Prayers are always heard, she says. Whether they're answered the way you want is God's business, not yours. The theological fatalism is very medieval, this acceptance that suffering is just the human condition, that prayer is obligation rather than negotiation, that God's plans are mysterious and probably involve more suffering than comfort. Eleanor seems at peace with uncertainty in a way that modern people would find unsettling, but medieval Christianity was built on that foundation. Suffer now, hope for heaven later, don't ask too many questions in between. Around mid-morning, your group encounters another group of returning pilgrims, larger than yours, maybe 30 people moving slower but with better organization. They have a leader, a former soldier named Robert, who apparently decided that organizing pilgrims is better employment than actual soldiering, which tells you something about medieval military pay. After brief negotiation, nobody wants to merge groups because coordinating 17 people is already chaos. You agree to travel within sight of each other for mutual protection against bandits, creating a loose confederation of suffering that stretches along the road. The landscape feels different on the return. The same fields, same villages, same roads, but your perception has changed. Going to Canterbury, every landmark was new, every mile a progression. Returning, it's all repetition, a reverse playback of suffering you've already experienced. You recognize the village where you bought overpriced ale. There's the hill that destroyed everyone's legs. That's the bridge where the groups merged. Memory and landscape overlap, creating a weird déjà vu where everything is familiar but nothing is comforting. The Dyer brothers, walking near you, are discussing business with the kind of focus that suggests they view this entire pilgrimage as an unfortunate interruption to their real lives. We've lost a week of work. One complains. That's a week of cloth we could have processed, orders we could have filled. This salvation better be worth it. The other brother nods, adding, and the competition won't wait. Benedict's dye shop will be taking our customers while we're out here blessing our feet bloody. Medieval working-class pilgrimage was a significant economic sacrifice, lost wages, travel costs, time away from trade, and you're listening to the cold calculation of whether spiritual benefits outweigh financial losses. Lunch is your bread and cheese, eaten while walking because nobody wants to waste time stopping. The bread is already stale, the cheese is sweating in the weak sun, and you're rationing aggressively because 3 days of food needs to stretch for what's probably 5 days of walking. You watch others eating similarly grim provisions, and the competitive suffering of the journey outweighs more devout, whose more penitenta's been replaced by competitive poverty, who can stretch their food furthest, whose feet are worse, who's more likely to not make it home. The barefoot carpenter, Thomas, because of course another Thomas is struggling visibly. His feet are shredded, leaving bloody footprints on the dusty road, and he's walking with a limp that suggests bone-deep damage. Someone suggests he wrap his feet in cloth, but he refuses. Made a vow. He insists. Barefoot to Canterbury and back. God's watching. The theological commitment is admirable or idiotic depending on your perspective, and you can't decide which. Medieval vows were binding contracts with God. Breaking them was worse than the original sin you were atoning for. So Thomas will walk barefoot until his feet are stumps or he dies, whichever comes first. Around afternoon, Eleanor starts telling stories to pass the time, and they're the kind of stories that reveal medieval worldview in ways formal histories never capture. She talks about a neighbor who went on pilgrimage to Walsingham and came back cured of blindness. Well, not cured exactly, still couldn't see, but felt better about it, which is nearly the same thing. She describes a cousin who walked to Santiago de Compostela in Spain and was murdered by bandits 2 days from home on the return journey. But his soul went straight to heaven, so really, he won the pilgrimage lottery. The casual acceptance of death, the flexible definition of miracles, the belief that suffering has spiritual value regardless of outcome, it's all very medieval, very foreign, very familiar. The afternoon brings the first real crisis. Thomas the carpenter collapses. Not dramaticalino great fall. No cry of pain, just a slow sinking to his knees and then to his side. His body finally filing a complaint his will can't override. His feet are infected badly, showing the red streaks that even medieval people understood meant blood poisoning. And his forehead is hot with fever. The group stops, circles around him, and faces the question nobody wants to answer. What do you do with a dying pilgrim on the return journey? The dyers vote for leaving him in the next village with whatever money the group can spare. Eleanor insists on staying with him, at least until he recovers or dies. Others argue for carrying him, though nobody volunteers to actually do the carrying. The debate reveals the harsh pragmatism of medieval travel. Compassion is lovely in theory, but practical survival often requires abandoning the weak. There's no emergency services, no hospitals, no rescue system. You either keep up or get left behind, and the group's collective survival outweighs individual need. Eventually, they compromise, carry Thomas to the next village, which someone thinks is maybe 3 miles ahead, find a church or monastery, Leave him with the monks and a donation from the group's collective funds. And continue. It's not ideal, but medieval ethics operated on not ideal as their baseline. They fashion a stretcher from cloaks and walking staffs, getting quite practiced at medieval emergency medicine. And 4 men take the first carrying shift while Thomas moans deliriously about angels and debts and unfinished carpentry projects. The 3 miles to the village stretch into something longer. Medieval distance estimation was basically guessing plus optimism, and the carrying rotation becomes increasingly resentful. Thomas isn't light. The makeshift stretcher keeps threatening to collapse, and everyone's already exhausted from walking. You take a carrying shift and feel your shoulders immediately protest. Your infected feet somehow hurting more when you're carrying weight. Your back discovering new ways to express discomfort. Historians still argue whether medieval pilgrims developed stronger bodies or just developed higher pain tolerances. But from your position, literally carrying another person's suffering, you're voting for the pain tolerance theory. The village, when you finally reach it, is barely a village, maybe a dozen buildings, 1 church, lots of pigs, and a general air of poverty that suggests leaving Thomas here isn't so much compassionate care as abandonment with extra steps. The priest, a young man who looks barely 20 and seems overwhelmed by basic parish duties, agrees to care for Thomas for a donation of 10 pennies from the group's collective funds, which people contribute with varying degrees of willingness. You give your last penny, which means you're now completely broke with 3 days of walking ahead. But leaving a dying man without contributing feels spiritually worse than potential starvation. Thomas, barely conscious, thanks everyone in a whisper that might be his last words or might just be fever talking. The priest administers last rites just in case while the group shuffles awkwardly, watching a man they've known for days prepare to die among strangers in a village whose name they don't know. Eleanor cries quietly. The dyers look impatient. You feel numb, which is becoming your default emotional state for medieval tragedy. You leave Thomas there, and nobody speaks for the next hour. The deather near death. You're not sure which hangs over the group like a pall, making the already grim return journey even grimmer. Someone mutters that Thomas should have wrapped his feet, vow or no vow, and someone else snaps that judging a dying man is poor spiritual form. And briefly, it seems like the group might fragment entirely over theological disagreement about foot coverings. Robert, the leader of the other pilgrim group that's been paralleling yours, calls out that there's a pilgrim hospice another 5 miles ahead, and both groups should push to reach it before dark. 5 miles sounds impossible, feels impossible, but the alternative is sleeping in a field, and after watching Thomas collapse, nobody wants to risk it. You walk. Your feet have transcended pain and entered a state of pure damage. You can feel something tearing with each step, something fundamental giving way. But you walk anyway because the alternative is becoming another Thomas. Another cautionary tale about pilgrims who didn't make it home. The hospice, when you reach it near dusk, is a grim stone building that makes the previous hospices look luxurious. It's run by a single elderly monk who seems surprised to have visitors, as if pilgrims returning from Canterbury are an unexpected development in his routine. Space for 30, he announces, which would be fine except your combined group's number 47. So the math requires creativity or cruelty. The sorting is brutal. Old and infirmed get beds. Families get beds. Women traveling alone get beds. Everyone else, including you, gets the floor, and not even a straw-covered floor, just cold stone in an ancillary room that might have been storage for turnips before it became overflow pilgrim housing. You collapse onto the stone with 17 other people, using your thin cloak as both mattress and blanket, and discover that stone is exactly as comfortable as it sounds, which is to say, not at all. Dinner is watery gruel that the monk calls pottage, but which is basically hot water that once knew a vegetable. No bread, no cheese, no meat, nothing of substance. Pilgrim's fare. The monk explains cheerfully, as if poverty is part of the spiritual experience rather than just poverty. You eat it anyway, drinking the warm water and telling yourself it's nourishing while your stomach files a formal complaint. Eleanor ends up on the floor near you, and in the darkness, she whispers, "Do you think Thomas is dead?" You don't know, truthfully. Medieval medicine being what it is, infection could kill in days or might mysteriously resolve. People died and recovered with equal randomness. Probably, you answer, because honesty seems appropriate when you're lying on cold stone contemplating your own mortality. Do you think it matters? She asks, like, spiritually. He completed the pilgrimage, touched the shrine. Does dying on the return journey count? It's a genuine theological question. Medieval pilgrimage vows typically specified reaching the shrine, but the implicit understanding was also returning safely to resume your life as a better Christian. If you die on the way back, have you succeeded or failed? Historians still argue whether completion required survival or just shrine contact, and the Church's position was conveniently ambiguous, probably to avoid discouraging pilgrims with high mortality statistics. I think, you say slowly, God's probably less worried about the technicalities than we are. Eleanor laughs quietly, a sound that's more tired than amused. That's the hope, isn't it? That all this, she gestures vaguely at the stone floor, the sleeping pilgrims, the entirety of medieval existence, that it means something even when it feels meaningless. Sleep comes in fragmented pieces, interrupted by cold, stone hardness, and the sounds of 47 people trying to sleep in a building designed for 30. Someone's snoring, someone's crying, someone's praying, and someone has digestive issues that are making the closed room progressively less breathable. You drift in and out of consciousness, your dreams mixing with reality, walking endless roads, touching golden shrines that turn to dust, watching Thomas rise from his deathbed and walk barefoot into the sky. You wake before dawn because the stone is too cold and too hard to allow real sleep, and you're not alone. Half the floor sleepers are already awake, sitting in the darkness, waiting for enough light to justify leaving this place. Nobody speaks. What is there to say? You're broken, and at best halfway home, and the return journey's entire character is becoming clear. Survive until you don't. Hope it's enough. Pray the suffering had meaning. The monk leads brief morning prayers abbreviated because even he seems to want this crowd gone, and your combined groups spill out into the pre-dawn like refugees fleeing disaster, which, spiritually speaking, you might be. The road beckons, the same road it's always been, and you begin walking because walking is all there is. Thomas is probably dead. Your feet are definitely dying. And somewhere ahead, London waits, indifferent to your suffering. Welcome to the journey home, where miracles are scarce, death is common, and the only certainty is that medieval pilgrimage doesn't end at the shrine. It ends when you either make it home or join the countless anonymous pilgrims who didn't. You're on day 6 of what was supposed to be a spiritual journey, and the word spiritual has lost all meaning somewhere between the infected blisters and the existential dread. Your traveling group has developed a rhythm that's less organized pilgrimage and more collective shuffle toward potential survival, with everyone too exhausted for conversation, too broke for comfort, and too committed to turning back now. The road stretches ahead with the same dusty indifference it's shown for centuries, completely unconcerned with your medieval suffering or your modern sensibilities trapped in this nightmare. Your morning walking companion is one of the dire Brothersiavae, genuinely forgotten which one because they're interchangeable in their misery and their constant calculations about lost income. He's limping from a blister on his heel that he describes in medical detail you neither requested nor appreciate, and he's convinced that St. Thomas didn't actually heal anyone at the shrine because, if the saint had real power, wouldn't our feet be fine by now? It's a reasonable theological question that borders on heresy, and you're too tired to engage with it beyond a noncommittal grunt. Around mid-morning, your combined groups encounter something new on the return journey. A professional partner, one of those ecclesiastical salesmen who roam medieval England selling forgiveness like it's a commodity at market, which, spiritually speaking, kind of is. He set up a small operation at a crossroads, complete with a portable lectern, a collection of supposed relics in a decorative box, and the kind of practice patter that suggests he's done this routine 1,000 times. Pilgrims returning from Canterbury, he calls out, his voice carrying across the road with theatrical projection. Your sins may be reduced by St. Thomas's intercession, but why stop there? I carry pardons signed by bishops, indulgences approved by Rome, and relics of power. He holds up what he claims is a finger bone of St. Peter, which looks suspiciously like a chicken bone you saw at the Canterbury market, and several pilgrims actually stop to listen because apparently the human capacity for spiritual commerce is infinite. The partner launches into his sales pitch, explaining that touching the shrine was excellent, very spiritual. Much devotion but official documentation of forgiveness is better, and he happens to have papal indulgences available for the low price of just 3 pennies each. These documents, written in impressive Latin that nobody can read, supposedly guarantee reduced time in purgatory, forgiveness for specific sins, and general spiritual immunity for minor transgressions. It's medieval spiritual insurance, and the fact that it's probably fraudulent doesn't stop people from wanting it. Eleanor, walking beside you now, watches the pardoner with obvious contempt. Scavenger, she mutters, preying on pilgrims who've already suffered enough. But even she looks tempted, her hand moving toward the small purse where she keeps her last few coins, because the promise of documented salvation is powerful even when you suspect it's fake. Medieval Christianity ran on this tension between faith and fraud, with the Church itself often unable to distinguish between the two or unwilling to try. You watch 3 pilgrims buy indulgences, their precious remaining coins exchanging hands for rolled parchments with official-looking seals. The partner blesses each buyer with grand gestures and Latin phrases that sound important but might be complete nonsense, medieval religious theater at its finest. One buyer, a young man who's been walking barefoot in imitation of Thomas the Carpenter, asks if the indulgence covers the sin of doubt, and the partner doesn't even hesitate. All sins, my son, all sins past, present, and reasonably anticipated future ones, all covered under this comprehensive spiritual warranty. The other group's leader, Robert, finally intervenes, physically steering pilgrims away from the partner with the gruff authority of someone who's seen this scam before. Save your money for food, he tells them, God's forgiveness is free. It's just the paperwork that costs money. And God doesn't require paperwork. It's surprisingly good theology from a former soldier, and it breaks the pardoner's spell. The crowd disperses, though not without backward glances at those shiny parchments promising quantifiable salvation. The pardoner shouts after the departing pilgrims, something about passing up divine opportunities and the regret they'll feel in purgatory. But his heart isn't in it anymore. You've broken his sales momentum, and medieval con artists operated on momentum like modern ones. As you walk away, you hear him setting up for the next group of pilgrims coming from the opposite direction, his pitch refreshed, his relics ready, his spiritual merchandise available for those with coins and insufficient skepticism. Around noon, the landscape shifts into territory you definitely remember from the journey out, the forest where you were robbed. The trees close in with the same ominous energy. The shadows fall in the same threatening patterns, and your entire group tenses collectively, hands moving to walking staffs that might serve as weapons, eyes scanning the undergrowth for bandits who probably remember that pilgrims returning from Canterbury have even less money than pilgrims going there. Robert organizes a defensive formation without being asked, the more vulnerable pilgrims in the center, those with staffs or knives on the outside, everyone walking closer together to present a unified target that's hopefully too inconvenient to attack. It's medieval security theater, probably ineffective against determined bandits, but it makes everyone feel slightly safer, and psychological comfort counts for something when you're walking through robbery forest. The attack, when it comes, isn't from bandits but from something somehow worse. A pack of wild dogs, maybe 6 or 7 of them, lean and desperate in the way that medieval animals often were because nobody was feeding them and survival meant scavenging or hunting. They emerge from the tree line, not quite attacking but not quite avoiding, circling the group with the calculating energy of predators assessing prey. Medieval England had wolves, bears, and wild boars in the more remote areas, but dogs, feral descendants of domestic animals, were actually more common threats because they'd lost their fear of humans while retaining their pack hunting instincts. Your group bunches tighter, staffs raised, and someone throws a rock that misses badly but makes the point that you're willing to fight. The dogs keep circling, and you can see their ribs, their matted fur, their desperate hunger that might override their caution. Eleanor clutches her baby closer, and you realize that in medieval terms, an infant is basically just small, vulnerable food to animals that are starving. The standoff lasts maybe 2 minutes but feels eternal. Dogs circling, pilgrims brandishing inadequate weapons, everyone calculating odds and outcomes. Then Robert does something surprisingly smart. He pulls out his travel rations, what looks like dried meat, and throws it away from the group. The dogs immediately break formation, scrambling for the food, fighting among themselves over the scraps. And in that distraction, your group hurries forward, putting distance between yourselves and the pack. You walk quickly for the next mile, nobody speaking, everyone processing how close that came to disaster. Medieval animal attacks were common enough that they barely made it into records unless someone important died. But the psychological impact was real, the reminder that you're not the apex predator, that nature is hostile, that the forest harbors dangers your walking stick can't adequately address. Eleanor is crying quietly, probably thinking about what would happen to her baby if she didn't make it home. And nobody offers comfort because everyone's thinking the same thoughts about their own vulnerabilities. By afternoon, You've cleared the forest and entered familiar farmland, and the tension eases slightly. You're maybe 2 days from London now, if you can maintain pace, if nobody else collapses, if the weather holds, if a dozen other variables align in your favor. Medieval travel was a constant negotiation with if, and you're running out of contingency plans. Your food is gone, completely gone. The last piece of bread and final chunk of cheese were consumed this morning, and now you're walking on an empty stomach that's progressing from hunger to genuine physiological concern. Others in the group are in similar situations, comparing notes on who has what. Someone has an onion. Someone else has a handful of dried peas. Collectively, it might equal one meal if you're generous with the definition of meal. The Dyer brother suggests pooling resources, creating a communal dinner from everyone's scraps, which sounds socialist and practical until people start arguing about fair distribution. The person with an onion doesn't want to share it with 17 people because then they get basically nothing. The person with dried peas argues that peas require cooking. So where's the pot? Where's the fire? Where's the infrastructure for this plan? Medieval communal living worked in theory but often collapsed over the practical details of who gets what and why. Eventually, you stop at a stream to refill water skins and forage for anything edible. Medieval peasants were expert foragers, knowing which plants were safe, which were medicinal, which would kill you impressively fast. Your group has some of that knowledge. Eleanor identifies dandelion greens and wild garlic, but it's not exactly a feast. You end up with a handful of bitter greens, some questionable mushrooms that everyone agrees to avoid because medieval mushroom poisoning was both common and horrible, and the persistent understanding that you're basically one missed meal away from genuine starvation. Someone suggests stopping at the next village to beg for food, which is spiritually humiliating but practically necessary. Medieval begging was complicated. Pilgrims were supposed to receive Christian charity, but returning pilgrims had less moral authority than outbound ones because they'd already received their blessing, already completed their spiritual transaction. You were on your own for the return journey, and charity was discretionary rather than obligatory. The village, when you reach it around late afternoon, is small and obviously poor, the kind of place where asking for charity is like asking stones for bread. The village priest, a tired-looking man with the resigned air of someone managing poverty with insufficient resources, listens to your group's request and sighs deeply. We barely have enough for ourselves. He explains, not unkindly. The harvest was poor, the taxes were heavy, and we've already housed 3 groups of pilgrims this month. Robert negotiates, explaining that you're not asking for much, just some bread, maybe some pottage if they're cooking. The priest considers, calculating Christian duty against practical scarcity, and finally agrees to provide 1 meal for the group if you'll attend evening prayers and make a donation to the church. The donation requirement for charity is peak medieval economics. Will help you, but you have to pay for it, which isn't really charity, but everyone pretends it is for spiritual purposes. The group scrapes together maybe 8 pennies total, literally everything everyone has left, and hands it over with the bitter understanding that they've just purchased survival for 1 more day. The meal, served in the church courtyard, is the now familiar watery pottage with some bread so dense it could serve as construction material. But it's hot, it's food, and it's probably enough calories to make it to London without collapsing. So you eat with gratitude that's only slightly resentful. Evening prayers in the village church are sparsely attended, just your pilgrim group and maybe a dozen locals who look like they're here out of obligation rather than devotion. The priest leads services in Latin that he clearly doesn't fully understand, mumbling through sections and skipping parts entirely, and you realize that medieval village Christianity was often this rote, this automatic, faith expressed through repetition rather than comprehension. After prayers, the priest offers the church floor for sleeping, which is generous or just practical. Keeping pilgrims in sight prevents them from stealing from the village overnight, which apparently has been a problem before. You settle on the stone floor again. Always stone. Never anything comfortable, and Eleanor ends up beside you, her baby finally quiet after fussing through the service. One more day, she whispers in the darkness. Maybe two. Then home. Then back to normal life. Then this all becomes a story I tell. You ask if she feels changed, transformed, spiritually elevated by the pilgrimage, and she laughs quietly. I feel tired, broke, and grateful to be alive. If that counts as spiritual transformation, then yes, very transformed. It's honest in a way that medieval people probably felt but rarely articulated, because admitting that pilgrimage was mostly suffering with ambiguous spiritual benefits undermined the whole system. But here, in the darkness, with the journey almost over and the performance of devotion exhausted, Eleanor can admit that maybe the pilgrimage was just a walk, just an obligation fulfilled, just something that happened without necessarily meaning anything profound. You sleep poorly, the stone is cold. Your stomach is still complaining about insufficient food, and your feet have progressed beyond pain into a numb tingling that's probably nerve damage. Tomorrow you'll walk again, probably the last full day before reaching London. And then this entire medieval nightmare can become a memory you'll spend years trying to explain to people who'll never understand, because they didn't live it, didn't feel it, didn't walk 70 miles in shoes made of leather scraps and regret. Outside, a dog barks, maybe one from the pack, maybe just a village dog, and the sound carries across the night like a reminder that you're not safe yet, not home yet, not done yet. Medieval life was a constant state of not yet, always one disaster away from catastrophe, always one good fortune away from comfort, never quite secure in either direction. Tomorrow, London, probably. Home, maybe. Survival, hopefully. Welcome to day 6. Where spiritual enlightenment is replaced by tactical hunger management, and the primary prayer is just, please let this end soon. You wake on day 7 to the sound of rain drumming on the church roof, which is nature's way of saying your final push to London will be conducted in maximum medieval misery. The stone floor has left you with bruises in places you didn't know could bruise. Your feet have achieved a state of damage that probably has a medical Latin name you don't want to learn. And the collective groan that rises from 17 pilgrims simultaneously realizing they have to walk in the rain is the saddest sound you've ever heard. The village priest provides a breakfast of surprise bread and water, though calling it breakfast feels generous when it's basically just acknowledging that you're conscious and might need minimal calories to remain that way. The bread is from yesterday, possibly from last week, with a texture suggesting it's been used as a doorstop before being repurposed as food. You eat it anyway because the alternative is walking 20-some miles on an empty stomach, and your body has already filed enough grievances without adding voluntary starvation to the list. The rain when you step outside is the persistent English drizzle that's more atmosphere than precipitation, but somehow manages to soak everything anyway. Within minutes, your wool cloak, which is supposed to be water-resistant, becomes a soggy, heavy blanket that smells like wet sheep, because that's literally what it is. Dead sheep fibers absorbing water and sharing the olfactory experience with everyone around you. Medieval rain gear was basically just accepting that you'd be wet and hoping you wouldn't also be cold, which was optimistic thinking that rarely panned out. Your group sets out with the enthusiasm of condemned prisoners walking to execution, and the rain immediately transforms the road into the familiar mud soup you've come to know and hate. Each step is a negotiation between forward progress and getting stuck, your feet squelching in your ruined shoes, mud splattering up your legs until your hose are more brown than their original color, which you can no longer remember. The Dyer brothers are particularly miserable because their professional knowledge of textiles means they understand exactly how much damage this water is doing to everyone's clothing, complete ruin. One mutters, "Every garment here is absolutely ruined." Around mid-morning, Eleanor's baby starts crying, and this time he won't stop. The child has been remarkably tolerant of this pilgrimage, sleeping through crowds, staying quiet during prayers, generally being the best-behaved medieval infant in England, but apparently 6 days of being strapped to a mother walking through rain and misery has exceeded even his tiny tolerance threshold. Eleanor tries everything, singing, rocking, offering what little milk she can produce on a starvation diet, but the baby just cries and cries and cries, the sound cutting through the rain like an auditory knife. The crying affects the group's morale immediately and dramatically. People who were tolerating the rain with gritted teeth start snapping at each other. Someone suggests Eleanor should have left the baby with family, which is both impractical and unhelpful. Someone else mutters that the crying is attracting bandits, which is ridiculous, but anxiety doesn't care about logic. Eleanor herself looks close to breaking, tears mixing with rain on her face, and you realize that medieval motherhood involved a level of endurance that modern people can barely comprehend, carrying a child while walking endless miles, feeding that child while starving yourself, maintaining sanity while everything around you is chaos. You offer to carry the baby for a while, and Eleanor looks so grateful she might cry harder than the infant. The baby transfers to your arms, still screaming, unimpressed by the change in management, and you immediately understand why Eleanor looked exhausted. The child is heavier than he looks, squirmy in that way babies are, and crying directly into your ear with impressive lung capacity. You walk while bouncing him, humming tunelessly, basically doing the medieval version of "Please stop crying, I'll do anything," which is universal parenting across all centuries. Miraculously, or perhaps just coincidentally, the baby quiets after about 15 minutes, reduced to wet hiccuping sobs and then eventually to silence. You've either soothed him or he's exhausted himself into submission, and you don't care which as long as the crying stops. Eleanor reclaims her child with whispered thanks, and you notice that the group's mood has improved slightly. Sometimes shared suffering is bearable, but listening to a baby cry while suffering is its own special hell. The rain continues, the road continues, the suffering continues, and around noon you crest a hill and see something that makes the entire group stop and stare. London in the distance. This may be 10 miles away, visible across the flat river valley. Smoke rising from thousands of hearths. The city walls a dark line against the gray sky. You've seen London before you left from the rebut, seeing it now as a destination rather than a starting point triggers an emotional response you weren't expecting. Relief, yes, but also something like triumph. The understanding that you've actually done this impossible thing. Walked to Canterbury and almost back. Survived when survival wasn't guaranteed. Robert, the former soldier leading the other group, lets out a genuine laugh. There she is, he announces. The finest, dirtiest, most beautiful city in England. We're almost home. Pilgrims. The word home hits differently for everyone. Some people are from London. Some are passing through to villages beyond. Some might not have homes anymore after being gone for weeks without income, but the sentiment is universal. The journey is almost over. The final stretch should be energizing, but instead, everyone's bodies seem to have been waiting for permission to quit, and seeing London provides that permission. People start limping more obviously, as if acknowledging the destination makes hiding the pain unnecessary. The barefoot carpenter's replacement, a young laborer doing penance for stealing breads. It's down at the roadside and refuses to stand, his feet finally staging a complete revolt. "Just leave me," he says with the melodramatic fatalism of someone who's walked past their breaking point. "I'll crawl the rest tomorrow." Nobody leaves him, but nobody wants to carry him either, so an argument erupts about obligations, Christian charity, and the practical limits of mutual aid. Eventually, the laborer agrees to try walking if someone lends him a shoulder for support, and one of the Dyer brothers, showing surprising compassion or just wanting the argument to end, volunteers. They set off together, a slow three-legged race toward London that sets the pace for the entire group. The road descends toward the river valley, and the rain finally stops, replaced by a mist that's somehow more penetrating than the rain was. Your clothes are soaked. Your shoes are disintegrating. You can see your toes through holes that weren't there this morning, and your body temperature is dropping into concerning territory. Medieval hypothermia was a real risk, especially in wet conditions, and you're starting to understand why pilgrims sometimes died within sight of their destination, their bodies simply giving up when the end was near. Around mid-afternoon, you encounter the first real sign of London's proximity: traffic. Not just pilgrims anymore, but merchants with wagons, farmers bringing goods to market, messengers on horseback, the normal flow of medieval commercial life. The road widens, improves slightly, becomes more traveled and therefore less impossible. There are actual marker stone posts indicating miles to London, crosses marking parish boundaries, even a gibbet with a corpse swinging gently in the wind as a cheerful reminder of civil law enforcement. Your group merges with the general traffic, losing its distinct identity, becoming just more bodies moving toward London in the eternal flow of medieval mobility. Eleanor walks beside you, her baby sleeping finally, and she's quiet, maybe processing that the journey is actually ending, that she'll return to her life of widowhood and debt and 3 children who've been without their mother for a week. Was it worth it? You ask, which is the question everyone's been avoiding because the answer might be disappointing. She considers for a long time, long enough that you think she might not answer. Then, "I don't know. I prayed. I suffered. I touched the shrine. My debts are still there. My husband's still dead. But I did iti walk to Canterbury like I promised. And that means something, even if I can't say what." It's the most honest assessment of pilgrimage you've heard, acknowledging both the significance and the ambiguity, the spiritual value and the practical uselessness. The sun makes a brief appearance before sunset, breaking through the clouds just long enough to create dramatic lighting that makes London look almost majestic instead of just big and dirty. The city walls are closer now, maybe 3 miles, and you can distinguish individual gates, church spires, the Tower of London jutting up like a stone finger. Medieval London housed maybe 40,000 people, making it England's largest city by far, and from this distance it looks like civilization, safety, the end of wilderness and the return to something like normal life. But here's where medieval pilgrimage throws its final complication. Most of your group isn't stopping in London. The Dyers live in London, yes, and a few others, but Eleanor is continuing to Southwark. Others are heading to villages beyond. And the journey home doesn't actually end at London's gates for everyone. The group that's walked together for days, shared suffering and scarce resources, is about to dissolve like it never existed, people scattering to their individual destinations without ceremony or formal goodbye. Robert announces that his group is stopping at London for the night. There's a pilgrim hospice near the bridge that he knows, and anyone who wants to join is welcome. About half your combined groups take him up on it. The London-bound or the too exhausted to continue. The rest, including Eleanor and yourself, prepare to push through the city and beyond, because stopping now would just mean starting again tomorrow. And the momentum of nearly finishing is too powerful to waste. You reach London's gates around dusk, and the guards barely glance at your bedraggled pilgrim group before waving you through. Medieval border control was inconsistent, sometimes thorough inspections, sometimes total indifference, depending on the guard's mood, the time of day, and whether they thought you were worth the effort of searching. You shuffle through the gates into London proper, and the city assaults your senses immediately. The smell of thousands of people and their waste, the sound of merchants closing shops and taverns opening, the narrow streets that force your group into single file, the overwhelming sense of density after days in the countryside. The city feels alien after the pilgrimage, too loud, too crowded, too full of people who aren't suffering together. Londoners push past your group with the impatience of locals dealing with tourist pilgrims. Street vendors shout about meat pies and ale, and somewhere a fight breaks out over something trivial, fists flying while onlookers place bets. Medieval urban life was intense, compressed, all of humanity's best and worst instincts packed into a walled space with insufficient sewage and excessive ambition. Your reduced group, maybe 10 pilgrims, now threads through London streets toward the southern gate and the bridge to Southwark. Eleanor is quiet, nervous about seeing her children, about explaining where she's been and why it matters. The Dyer brother who stayed with the group is calculating lost income, muttering numbers under his breath. Everyone's processing the end differently, some relieved, some disappointed, some just numb. London Bridge appears ahead, the famous medieval bridge lined with shops and houses built directly on the structure, creating a street that spans the Thames. You've crossed it before, but tonight it feels significant. Crossing the bridge is crossing from the pilgrimage back to normal life, from sacred journey to secular existence. The bridge is crowded even at dusk. Londoners going about their business, completely indifferent to your spiritual achievement or your suffering. You cross the bridge, the Thames flowing dark below, and Southwark opens ahead. London's southern suburb, technically outside the city walls, famous for its inns, theaters, and general moral flexibility. Eleanor's village is another 2 miles south, she says, and she'll walk it alone because that's her journey to finish. The group says goodbye to her there on the bridge, brief farewells that acknowledge shared experience without dwelling on it. Medieval people didn't have time for elaborate goodbyes. You walk together. Now you don't. Life continues. You watch Eleanor disappear into the Southwark streets, her baby bundled against her chest, and you wonder if you'll ever know whether her prayers were answered, whether her debts were resolved, whether the pilgrimage changed anything concrete in her life or just gave her a story to tell. Probably you'll never know, and that's very medieval. People enter your life intensely, share profound experiences, and then vanish completely, their stories unfinished from your perspective. Your own destination is vague somewhere in London, you suppose, or maybe beyond, depending on where your pre-pilgrimage life was located. The details feel foggy, dreamlike, because you've been so focused on survival that the concept of after barely registered. But the pilgrimage is effectively over. You walked to Canterbury, touched the shrine, walked back. Your feet are destroyed. Your clothes are rags. You're broke and exhausted and probably malnourished. But you did it. The final members of your group peel off one by one, someone to a house in Southwark, someone continuing south, someone just sitting down at a tavern threshold and refusing to walk another step. You're alone finally, just you and medieval London and the aftermath of a journey that medieval people did regularly but which has nearly destroyed you. The street around you is busy with evening commerce taverns filling, shops closing, people living their lives completely unaware that you've just completed an epic journey of suffering and ambiguous spiritual value. You find a quiet doorway to sit in, just for a moment, to rest feet that have carried you approximately 140 miles round trip in shoes that stopped being shoes around day 3. Tomorrow you'll figure out what comes next, finding shelter, finding food, finding whatever life you had before this pilgrimage consumed a week of suffering. But tonight, you just sit, watching medieval London continue around you, and you feel not transformed, not enlightened, not spiritually elevated, just tired, just done, just grateful to have survived. Welcome to day 7, the almost end, where the destination is reached but the journey's meaning remains elusive, and the primary achievement is simply not dying, which in medieval terms is actually pretty significant. You wake in the doorway where you apparently fell asleep, which is both dangerous and unsanitary by any century's standards, but exhaustion made the decision for you. It's barely dawn, the light gray and weak, and you're still alive, which, given that you spent the night unconscious in medieval Southwark, a neighborhood famous for crime, poverty, and general moral flexibility, counts as a minor miracle. Your body has stiffened overnight into a configuration that suggests rigor mortis was practicing on you, and standing requires a negotiation between will and physical possibility that takes several painful minutes. The streets are already stirring with early morning activity, bakers firing ovens, servants hauling water, people with actual jobs and lives moving with purpose, while you stand there like a monument to pilgrimage failure, still wearing the same filthy clothes you've worn for 8 days, your feet wrapped in bandages that are more dried blood than cloth. Your pilgrim badge, remember that badge from Canterbury? Hanging crooked on your chest like a medal from a war nobody won. Your immediate problems are numerous and pressing. No money, no food, no clear destination, and a body that's functioning on spite and muscle memory rather than actual health. Medieval London's charity system existed but was inconsistent. Churches might provide bread, monasteries might offer shelter, but might was doing heavy lifting in that sentence. You needed connections. You needed to look deserving rather than just desperate. Or you needed luck, and you're fresh out of all three. You start walking, not because you have a plan, but because standing still in medieval Southwark attracts the wrong kind of attention. A group of men too well-dressed to be beggars, too rough to be merchants eye you with professional assessment, probably calculating whether you're worth robbing and concluding, correctly, that you literally have nothing left to take. Medieval street crime was economically rational. Thieves targeted people with resources, and you're clearly resourced out. The morning brings you across London Bridge again, back into the city proper, and you're struck by how indifferent London is to your achievement. You walk to Canterbury. You touched the shrine of England's most famous martyr. You survived a pilgrimage that killed people regularly, and London doesn't care. The city continues its medieval routine: craftsmen opening shops, apprentices running errands, merchants arguing over prices, life proceeding exactly as it did before you left, completely unaltered by your spiritual journey. You find yourself outside a church St. Magnus the Martyr. According to the sign, you can barely read through medieval spelling creativity and slip inside hoping for sanctuary or at least a place to sit without judgment. The interior is cool, dim, smelling of incense and old stone, with a handful of early worshippers scattered among the pews engaged in private prayers. A priest is preparing the altar for morning mass, moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone who's done this particular routine several thousand times. You collapse onto a rear pew, and the simple act of sitting on wood instead of stone or dirt feels luxurious. Your feet throb with their own heartbeat. Your stomach gurgles its emptiness complaint, and you realize you're not just Tori approaching the edge of what a body can endure before it starts making executive decisions about shutting down non-essential functions, like consciousness and will to live. The priest notices you eventually hard to miss the filthy, bleeding pilgrim contaminating his nice church and approaches with the cautious expression of someone unsure whether you're devout or just vagrant. "You've come from pilgrimage?" he asks, noting the Canterbury badge, and you nod because speaking requires energy you're rationing. "Recently returned?" "Yesterday." "You manage," and your voice sounds foreign, hoarse from disuse and dehydration. "No money. No food. No." You trail off because the list of things you don't have is basically everything. The priest Father Oswald. He introduces himself sighs in that particular way religious professionals sigh when Christian charity conflicts with practical resource management. "We provide bread after morning mass," he explains. "1 loaf per person, and you'll need to move along after. The city has rules about vagrants, even pilgrim vagrants. It's compassion with caveats, charity with conditions, very medieval in its simultaneous generosity and limitations. Morning mass proceeds around you, Latin prayers washing over your consciousness like verbal waves while you drift in and out of awareness. You're not sleeping exactly, more just existing in a state of minimal function. Your body engaged in triage: keep the heart beating, keep the lungs working, worry about higher functions like coherent thought later. The service ends. Bread is distributed, a small brown loaf that's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, and you eat it sitting right there in the pew, tearing chunks with your teeth because medieval bread requires aggressive consumption. The bread helps immediately and insufficiently. Your stomach stops its urgent complaining but reminds you that 1 loaf after days of starvation is a down payment on recovery, not the full amount. Father Oswald returns after the bread distribution, and this time he's accompanied by an older woman, severe-looking, with the kind of face that suggests she spent decades managing church charity and has seen every scam, every lie, every manipulation. "This is Marjorie," Father Oswald introduces. "She manages our lay hospitality." "Marjorie, this pilgrim just returned from Canterbury, needs assistance." Marjorie assesses you with professional thoroughness, noting the genuine badge, the destroyed feet, the authentic filth of real travel versus the performative dirt of local beggars. Medieval charity administrators became expert at distinguishing deserving from undeserving poor, and Marjorie has clearly mastered the art. Feet first. Marjorie announces with the authority of someone who's given this speech before. Can't help anyone who can't walk, and you can barely stand. Come. It's not a request, so you follow well. Hobble after as she leads you to a small room attached to the church where she maintains what appears to be a medieval medical station. Herbs, bandages, a basin of water that might be clean, and the kind of no-nonsense attitude that suggests she'll fix you whether you cooperate or not. She unwraps your feet with surprising gentleness, her expression barely changing as she reveals the full damage. Infections, blisters on blisters, blackened toenails, skin that's sloughed off revealing raw tissue underneath, and a smell that suggests your feet are considering independence from your body. Canterbury? She asks, and you nod. Barefoot penance? You shake your head. Just bad shoes and stubbornness. Then, typical. Marjorie's treatment is pragmatic medieval medicine. She washes your feet in water mixed with vinegar, which burns like holy fire but probably kills some infection, applies a poultice that smells of honey and herbs you can't identify, and wraps everything in clean cloth with practiced efficiency. Honey's good for wounds, she explains, noting your skeptical expression. Keeps them clean, helps them heal. Ancient knowledge. Works better than half the nonsense physicians prescribe. She's right. Actually, honey has antimicrobial properties, and medieval medical practitioners stumbled onto effective treatments through trial and error even without understanding the mechanisms. Historians still argue whether medieval medicine was mostly harmful or occasionally helpful. But from your position as someone receiving care that might actually work, you're voting for occasionally helpful. Rest for 3 days. Marjorie orders. Keep those feet elevated. Change the bandages daily. After that, you can probably walk again, though I'd wait a week if you're smart. 3 days sounds impossible. You have nowhere to stay, no resources, no claim on anyone's hospitality, and your face must show it because Marjorie sighs. There's a pilgrim recovery house in Aldgate, run by the Sisters of Mercy. Tell them Marjorie sent you. Show your badge. They'll give you a week of shelter and basic food while you heal. After that, you're on your own. The Sisters of Mercy house is a walk, painful, slow, but manageable with Marjorie's new bandages across medieval London, through streets that are fully awake now, crowded with the business of living. You navigate markets selling fish that definitely aren't fresh, past artisan shops where apprentices are being yelled at in multiple languages, through neighborhoods that shift from respectable to questionable within a single street. The city's economic geography written in architecture and activity. Aldgate is near the eastern wall, and the recovery house is a modest 2-story building marked only by a wooden cross above the door. You knock more of a desperate lean against the door. Rillian, a nun, answers, middle-aged, with the kind but exhausted expression of someone who deals with broken pilgrims regularly. You mumble Marjorie's name, show your badge, and explain nothing because explaining requires more energy than you have. Another Canterbury pilgrim, the nun's sister Anne, says to someone inside, "Feet are bad. Probably hasn't eaten properly in days. Standard return journey condition." She ushers you inside without additional questions, and you realize this house exists specifically for pilgrims like you, the ones who made it to the shrine but are falling apart on the return, the overlooked second half of the journey where survival becomes uncertain. The house interior is simple, clean, with a large common room where maybe a dozen other pilgrims in various states of recovery are resting. Some are rebandaging wounds. Others are just sleeping in actual beds with actual blankets. And one man is crying quietly while staring at nothing, probably processing trauma or loss or the psychological aftermath of extreme pilgrimage. Medieval PTSD wasn't recognized as a condition, but the symptoms were definitely present. People returned from pilgrimages changed, sometimes damaged, always marked by experiences that normal life couldn't fully accommodate. Sister and shows you to a Bedtime actual bed with a straw mattress and a blanket, and the luxury of horizontal rest on something purpose-built for sleeping nearly makes you cry. Dinner is at Vespers. She explains, breakfast after lauds. There's a washing room if you want to clean up, and we have spare clothes if yours are beyond saving, which they definitely are. She pauses, then adds gently, you're safe now. Rest. Rest comes immediately and deeply, your body seizing the opportunity to shut down non-essential functions and focus on the critical work of not dying. You sleep through the day, through dinner apparently, through evening prayers, through the night, a sleep so profound it's almost medical, your body in repair mode while consciousness takes an extended vacation. You really wake, not the half-conscious stirring of the past weekday morning light and the sound of other pilgrims moving around. Your feet still hurt, but differently, less like active damage and more like healing tissue complaining about the process. Your stomach is empty but not desperate. Your mind feels clearer, like fog has lifted, and you can actually process thoughts beyond walk and survive. Sister and brings breakfast porridge with honey, bread, even a small piece of cheese, and sits with you while you eat. You've been asleep for nearly 2 days, she says, which explains the profound hunger and the disorientation. We checked on you periodically, made sure you were breathing and not feverish. Your body needed the rest. 2 days. You've lost 2 days to sleep, which means it's been 10 days since you left London for Canterbury. 10 days that feel like months, that feel like years, that feel like a completely separate lifetime. You ask Sister and how many pilgrims come through the recovery house, and she considers before answering. Maybe 50 a month during pilgrimage season. She estimates. Canterbury, Walsingham, some returning from longer journeys to Rome or Santiago. Most are like you, feet destroyed, resources exhausted, needing a few days to remember they're human before going back to their lives. Some are worse, sick with infections or diseases picked up on the road. We lose maybe 1 a month. People who got too close to death on the journey and couldn't quite come back. 1 a month. 12 pilgrims a year dying in this recovery house alone. And there are probably dozens of such houses across England, plus all the pilgrims who die on the road, in villages, in forests, uncounted and unmarked. Medieval pilgrimage mortality was a silent epidemic. People dying for faith or dying because of it. The line between martyrdom and tragedy blurred beyond distinction. You spend 3 more days at the recovery house, healing slowly, eating regularly, talking with other recovering pilgrims whose stories are variations on your experience. Suffering, ambiguous spiritual transformation, physical damage, and the strange letdown of achieving a goal that doesn't feel as meaningful as expected. A man from York walked to Canterbury to cure his blindness and remains blind but claims he sees more clearly now, which is either profound faith or sophisticated rationalization. A woman from Dover walked on her knees for penance and can barely walk at all now, her knees permanently damaged, but she insists the pain is God's grace, which is either beautiful devotion or tragic delusion, possibly both. On your fourth day, Sister Anne tells you gently that you need to leave soon. The house has limited space, and new broken pilgrims are arriving daily. She provides you with clean clothes, basic supplies for travel, and 2 pennies for your journey forward, which is institutional charity at its finest. Help you enough to survive, not enough to become dependent. You thank her with genuine gratitude mixed with anxiety about rejoining the world beyond the recovery house's protective bubble. Before you leave, you ask Sister Anne the question that's been bothering you since Canterbury. Do pilgrimages actually work? Do they heal people, grant forgiveness, change anything real? She's quiet for a long moment, and when she answers, it's with the honesty of someone who's seen too much to believe simple answers. Sometimes, she says, sometimes people are healed. Sometimes they find peace. Sometimes their lives genuinely change. Sometimes they just suffer and come back the same or worse. Faith isn't a transaction where you input suffering and output salvation. It's messier, more uncertain, more human than that. But the trying matters, I think. The willingness to walk the road, to seek something beyond yourself, even if what you find isn't what you expected, is probably the most honest assessment of pilgrimage you've heard, acknowledging both its potential and its limitations, the spiritual possibility and the frequent disappointment. You leave the recovery house wearing clothes that don't smell like medieval road trip, feet that are healing if not healed, and a perspective on medieval pilgrimage that's earned through experience rather than read in books. London continues around you, indifferent and eternal, a city that's seen thousands of pilgrims come and go, each one thinking their journey is unique while the city knows it's just another iteration of a very old pattern. You walk carefully, slowly, but you walk and realize you've achieved something genuinely medieval. You've suffered for faith, survived the experience, and emerged with more questions than answers, which is probably exactly what medieval Christianity intended all along. Welcome to Day 10. The aftermath, where survival is confirmed but meaning remains elusive, and the pilgrimage transforms from active suffering into memory, story, and the quiet understanding that you walk to Canterbury and back. And that has to be enough. You stand at the edge of London, 10 days after you first left, and the city looks exactly the same but you're entirely different, which is disorienting in a way medieval people probably felt but couldn't articulate because they lacked the vocabulary for existential displacement. Your feet are healing, wrapped in Sister Anne's clean bandages and stuffed into donated shoes that almost fit. Your body is recovering, fed by several days of actual food and actual rest. But something fundamental has shifted. Some understanding of what bodies can endure, what faith means, what medieval existence actually entails beyond the sanitized versions you thought you knew. The question of what happens next looms large and unanswerable. Medieval people returning from pilgrimage just resumed their lives back to the fields, the workshops, the daily grind of survival, but you're caught between medieval experience and modern consciousness, understanding both too much and too little about what comes after the shrine is touched and the journey is technically complete. The pilgrimage was supposed to transform you, and it has, just not in the ways medieval Christianity promised. You're not spiritually elevated, not divinely healed, not absolved of sins you may or may not have committed. You're just experienced, marked, changed in ways that are more physical than metaphysical. You decide to walk the city, to see London with post-pilgrimage eyes, and immediately notice things you missed before. The beggars outside churches aren't just poor-the-ree, often former pilgrims, people whose journeys destroyed them more permanently than yours did, who never quite made it back to functional life. An old man with no feet, actually no feet, stumps wrapped in rags, displays a pilgrim badge from Santiago de Compostela and begs for alms while telling his story to anyone who'll listen. Walked to Spain, miracle didn't happen, lost his feet to infection, crawled back to England, and now this. His story is a warning or a testament or just a fact, depending on your perspective. The city's pilgrimage economy is suddenly visible everywhere. Shops selling badges from shrines across Christendom, not just Canterbury, but Walsingham, Rome, Jerusalem, Santiago, dozens of saints' tombs and holy sites, each badge representing someone else's suffering and seeking. Partner works a street corner. The same sales pitch you heard on the road. Forgiveness for sale. Salvation at reasonable prices. God's grace available through papal documentation. Street preachers proclaim that pilgrimage is the path to heaven, while simultaneously warning that most pilgrims are secretly sinners using holy travel to excuse wandering, which is theologically confusing but probably accurate. You find yourself at a tavern, the Crossed Keys. According to a sign showing 2 keys that might be Peter's symbol or might just be keys, and with your last pennies, you buy weak ale and sit among Londoners who've never left the city, who experience religion through Sunday Mass and local saints' days, whose understanding of pilgrimage is entirely theoretical. They're discussing the upcoming Corpus Christi pageant, arguing about whether the Bakers' Guild will outperform the Weavers' Guild in the mystery plays, living lives that are confined and certain in ways pilgrims' lives never are. A man notices your Canterbury badge and asks the inevitable question, "Worth it?" He's genuinely curious, not mocking, and you realize he's considering his own pilgrimage, weighing the costs against potential benefits, trying to calculate whether walking to Canterbury will solve his problems or just create new ones. You want to give him a simple answer, yes or no, go or don't, but the truth is complicated, layered, resistant to easy summary. The shrine is real, you tell him, which is factual and unhelpful. The journey is harder than you imagine. Your feet will be destroyed. You'll spend all your money. You might die, or watch others die. And at the end, you touch a box containing bones, and then you have to walk home. He waits for more, for the spiritual assessment, the verdict on whether divine grace was achieved. You shrug. I can't tell you if it's worth it. I can only tell you what it costs. He nods slowly, processing, and orders another ale while contemplating his potential pilgrimage. You wonder if he'll go, if he'll join the endless flow of medieval people walking toward shrines seeking something healing, forgiveness, meaning, or just the accomplishment of having walked, and you wonder if he'll come back changed or just damaged, transformed or just tired. The ambiguity is frustrating but also honest, more truthful than the Church's promises of guaranteed salvation through sufficient suffering. The afternoon brings you to the banks of the Thames, watching the river flow with the same indifference it's shown for millennia, carrying London's waste and commerce toward the sea, completely unconcerned with human spiritual journeys. Medieval people believed water could be blessed, made holy through prayer and ritual, but the Thames is just water, dirty water, useful water, but not holy, not magical, just H2O flowing from higher ground to lower, following physics rather than theology. You notice other returned pilgrims scattered along the riverbank, identifiable by their badges and their particular kind of exhaustion. There's a camaraderie in the recognition you've all walked the roads, suffered the blisters, touched the shrines, made it back but also a distance, because each pilgrimage is ultimately solitary, an individual negotiation with faith that can't be fully shared. You nod to a woman with a Walsingham badge, and she nods back, and that's the entire interaction. Sufficient acknowledgement of shared experience without need for words. The bells ring for Vespers, the evening prayer service, and across London, people pause, cross themselves, murmur prayers in the direction of the nearest church. The rhythm of medieval life is structured by these liturgical hours, time measured not in minutes and hours but in prayer services, work periods defined by the space between religious obligations. You've been living in this rhythm for 10 days, waking to church bells, eating after prayers, sleeping to the sound of evening services. And now it feels natural, automatic, the medieval temporal framework internalized through experience. You find yourself walking, always walking, because apparently that's what you do now toward the church where Father Oswald provided bread on your first day back. He's there, conducting Vespers with the same mechanical efficiency, and when the service ends, he notices you in the back pew. You're healed. He observes, noting your improved appearance. The sisters took care of you? They did. You confirm. 3 days of rest, proper food, clean bandages. I can walk again without wanting to die. He smiles at that, and you realize medieval priests heard these stories constantly, pilgrims leaving broken, returning destroyed, slowly recovering, then leaving again to resume their lives. The cycle was endless, predictable, and Father Oswald was just one small part of the system that processed suffering into something society could manage. And spiritually, he asks, which is the question you've been avoiding. Did you find what you sought at Canterbury? It's complicated. You want to say. It's ambiguous, uncertain, resistant to simple assessment. But Father Oswald is waiting, genuinely interested, and maybe he's heard complicated answers before. Maybe medieval pilgrims often returned with uncertainty rather than conviction. I found the shrine. You answer carefully. I prayed. I touched the relics. I performed the rituals. Whether St. Thomas heard, whether my prayers were answered, whether I'm spiritually transformed, I honestly don't know. I feel different, but that might just be trauma and exhaustion masquerading as enlightenment. Father Oswald doesn't look disappointed by your uncertainty. Instead, he looks almost relieved, like your honesty confirms something he's long suspected. Faith isn't certainty, he says quietly. It's the willingness to seek despite uncertainty, to walk the road not knowing what you'll find. You went to Canterbury. You suffered. You sought. You returned. That's not nothing, even if it's not everything you hoped. It's generous theology, permission to have undertaken a pilgrimage without achieving clarity, acknowledgement that the journey might matter even when the destination disappoints. You thank him, and he blesses you with a casual sign of the cross, and you leave the church feeling not transformed but perhaps accepted. Your ambiguous pilgrimage experience validated by a priest who's seen enough pilgrims to know that certainty is rare and uncertainty is normal. The evening finds you in the streets again. You've become a wanderer, apparently someone who walks not toward destinations but just to walk, the pilgrimage habit persisting after the pilgrimage ends. You pass through Cheapside, London's main market street, where vendors are closing up for the night, packing away goods, counting earnings, sweeping detritus into streets that will be ankle-deep in garbage by morning. Medieval sanitation was basically, the street is everyone's trash can, and you've become so acclimated to the smell that you barely notice it anymore, which is adaptation or desensitization, possibly both. You encounter John, the professional pilgrim, of course you do, because medieval London is simultaneously huge and cramped, and recurring characters are inevitable. He's outside a tavern, already wearing a new badge, not Canterbury this time, but Walsingham, regaling a crowd with pilgrimage stories that are probably half true and half performance. He sees you, waves enthusiastically, and you're drawn into his orbit despite yourself. Canterbury Pilgrim, he announces to the crowd, pointing at your badge. Fresh from the shrine, still healing from the journey. Tell them about the crowds at Trinity Chapel, the Golden Shrine, the miracles. He's trying to use you as a testimonial, free marketing for the pilgrimage industry, and you're annoyed but also slightly amused by his entrepreneurial approach to religious devotion. It was crowded, you tell the assembled listeners, who are mostly drunk and mostly skeptical. Very crowded. The shrine is gold and jewels. The Canterbury water is probably just water. I walked 70 miles there and 70 miles back, destroyed my feet, spent all my money, and touched a box that maybe contains St. Thomas Becket's bones. The crowd is silent, processing this less than inspiring testimonial, and John looks betrayed by your honesty. But the spiritual experience? John prompts desperately. The divine presence? The feeling of grace? You shrug, because honesty has become your default since you ran out of energy for performance. I felt tired, mostly. Tired and wet and hungry and in pain. If that's grace, then yes, very graceful. Several people in the crowd laugh, appreciating the blasphemy or just the candidness, and John abandons you as a marketing tool, moving on to other potential pilgrims who might provide better testimonials. You leave him there, still selling pilgrimage as spiritual solution, and you're not angry, just aware that the pilgrimage economy requires both Johns, who promote it enthusiastically, and pilgrims like you, who experience it ambiguously, and somehow the system continues, year after year, century after century, people walking to shrines seeking something that maybe exists and maybe doesn't, suffering for faith that might grant salvation or might just grant suffering. The night deepens, and London's character shifts. The merchants retreat, the taverns fill, the streets become domains of people whose business operates after dark. Prostitutes, thieves, night soil collectors hauling away the day's waste, city watchmen patrolling with minimal enthusiasm. You're still wearing your pilgrim badge, which marks you as either devout or recently broke, and the night population leaves you alone, perhaps out of respect for religious travelers or perhaps because you obviously have nothing worth stealing. You find yourself at London Bridge again, standing where you stood days ago when the pilgrimage was ending and the return to normal life was beginning. The Thames flows below, dark and eternal, and London spreads behind you, thousands of lives being lived in parallel, each person in their own story, their own struggle, their own negotiation with existence. Medieval life was simultaneously communal and isolating. Everyone shared the same religious framework, the same economic hardships, the same basic struggle to survive, but each person experienced it alone, in their own body, with their own particular suffering. The bridge is quiet at this hour, Just a few travelers and one drunk man sleeping against a shop wall. You lean against the stone railing, feeling the cold through your clothes, and you think about the past 10 days. The walking, the pain, the deaths you witnessed, the people you met briefly and will never see again. Eleanor with her baby, probably back in her village now, still widowed, still in debt, but having completed her vow. Thomas the barefoot carpenter, probably dead in that village, buried by strangers, his vow fulfilled or broken depending on how God judges these things. The old man with visions who died the night before Canterbury, within sight of his spiritual goal, his pilgrimage both complete and incomplete. And you, standing on London Bridge at night, post-pilgrimage, post-transformation, post-everything the church promised. You're not healed in any medical sense. Your feet are damaged, probably permanently. You'll walk with a slight limp for the rest of your life, permanent reminder of this journey. You're not spiritually elevated, no divine visions, no profound revelations, no certainty about God's existence or interest in human affairs. You're just experienced. You know what medieval pilgrimage actually entails, beyond the sanitized versions and the church's promotional materials. You know the costs, physical, economic, psychological, and you know that the benefits are uncertain, individual, resistant to quantification. Medieval pilgrimage, you realize, was never really about the destination. The shrine was important. Yes, you needed a goal, a place to walk toward, but the transformation, such as it was, happened on the road. In the walking, the suffering, the community of fellow pilgrims, the daily negotiation with pain and doubt and persistence. You walked to Canterbury, but what you really did was walk through medieval England, through your own limits, through assumptions about faith and endurance and what human bodies can tolerate. The stars are visible between clouds, the same stars medieval people used for navigation, for astrology, for wondering about God's design. You're not wondering about design tonight. You're just here, on this bridge, having survived something that many didn't, carrying experiences that will fade but never fully disappear. The pilgrimage is over, but its effects will ripple forward in how you walk, how you think about faith, how you understand the gap between religious promise and human reality. A thought occurs, quiet but insistent, you could do it again. Not Canterbury, once is enough for any lifetime, but another shrine, another pilgrimage, another journey through medieval religious landscape. The idea is simultaneously appealing and horrifying. Appealing because there's something clarifying about pilgrimage, about reducing life to walking and surviving, about the forced simplicity of having one goal and pursuing it despite everything. Horrifying because you know exactly what it costs now. No illusions, no naive hope, just the certain knowledge of suffering ahead. But you won't decide tonight. Tonight is for standing on this bridge, for watching the Thames flow, for existing in the space between pilgrimage and life, between medieval experience and whatever comes next. Tomorrow will bring practical concerns, finding work, finding permanent shelter, reintegrating into London's economic and social systems. But tonight is yours, a moment of pause before the next thing begins. The city behind you is settling into sleep, fires being banked, shutters closing, the urban noise diminishing to a low hum of perpetual activity that never fully stops. Medieval London doesn't sleep. Exactly, there's always someone working, someone traveling, someone living their night while others sleep through it. You're part of it now, part of this medieval rhythm, marked by pilgrimage but returned to the flow of ordinary life. You push off from the bridge railing and start walking because walking is what you do now, what pilgrimage taught you, one foot in front of the other until you reach wherever you're going. The night is cool, the stars are distant, and London sprawls around you, indifferent and eternal. Your pilgrimage is complete. Your badge is earned. Your feet will heal, mostly, and life, whatever that means in medieval London, continues. Welcome to the end, which is also a beginning, where the journey concludes but the walking never quite stops. And you carry Canterbury with you not as transformation, not as salvation, but as experience, memory, and the quiet certainty that you walked there and back, and survived, and that has to be enough because it's all there is. And now, as the night deepens and the bridge stones grow colder beneath your feet, let yourself drift from London's medieval streets. The Thames flows on, carrying away the day's struggles, the week's suffering, the pilgrimage's pain. You've walked 70 miles to Canterbury and 70 miles back, destroyed your feet in pursuit of something you couldn't quite find, or perhaps found but couldn't quite recognize. The shrine is touched, the prayers are said, the journey is complete. Let the sounds of medieval London fade, the distant shouts of night watchmen, the creaking of shop signs in the wind, the eternal whisper of the river. Your body knows rest now, knows safety, knows that the walking is finally, truly done. The stars will overhead, the same stars that guided countless pilgrims before you, and will guide countless more after. But tonight, they're just stars, beautiful and distant and unconcerned with human journeys. Your breathing slows, matching the rhythm of the river, the rhythm of the sleeping city, the ancient rhythm of rest after labor. Medieval pilgrimage demanded everything: your strength, your money, your faith, your certainty, and you gave it all and survived. That's enough. That's more than enough. The badge on your chest catches starlight briefly, Thomas Beckett's profile gleaming, a small piece of pewter carrying the weight of your journey, your story, your survival. Let it all go now, the pain, the doubt, the questions without answers. Let the Thames carry them away, downstream, toward the sea, toward dissolution. You walked the medieval roads, touched the holy shrine, returned to tell the tale. Some pilgrims didn't make it back. You did. That's your miracle. Quiet and unglamorous, but real. You're here, on this bridge, in this moment, having done what you set out to do. The city breathes around you, a living thing of stone and wood and sleeping people, each with their own struggles, their own pilgrimages, their own roads to walk. But yours, for now, is walked. Your feet can rest. Your body can heal. Your mind can drift into sleep, carried on the gentle current of exhaustion earned through endurance, through completion, through having walked to Canterbury and back when many said you wouldn't survive. Close your eyes, there on the bridge, and feel the night embrace you. Let the medieval world soften and fade, its hardness giving way to the gentle darkness of sleep. You've earned this rest, this peace, this moment of stillness after movement. The pilgrimage is over. The journey is complete. And you, against all odds, are still here. Sleep now, pilgrim. Dream of roads that don't hurt to walk, of shrines that grant certainty, of journeys that end in clear transformation. Or don't dream at all. Just rest, deep and complete, the sleep of the truly exhausted, the genuinely accomplished, the remarkably, improbably survived. The stars watch, the river flows, and London dreams around you. Your pilgrimage is done. Your story is told. And in the telling, in the walking, in the surviving, you've become part of something larger, the endless procession of medieval pilgrims, each seeking, each suffering, each finding their own small piece of whatever lies at the end of the road. Rest now. You've walked far enough. You've suffered enough. You've earned your place among the pilgrims who made it home, who touched the shrine and lived to speak of it. Let that be sufficient. Let that be everything. Let that carry you into sleep, gentle and deep, the kind of rest that only comes after a journey truly completed. Sweet dreams, pilgrim, you made it. You actually made it. And that, in medieval terms, in human terms, in any terms that matter, is miraculous enough.